The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with red wax stamped by a family crest that meant money, power, and the absolute certainty that other people's lives were negotiable. Adelaide Veynor's father didn't knock. He walked into her bedroom, dropped the document onto her vanity mirror, and said 4 words that made her stomach turn cold. "You leave next Friday." Not a question, not even a conversation. Conrad Bellamy's name was already printed on the legal agreement. Her name was already signed by her father's hand, not her own. She was 26 years old, and someone had just sold her future like a piece of real estate. If that were you, if everything you were supposed to become had already been decided without you, what would you do? Before we go any further, if you're new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. These stories travel further than I ever imagined, and I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It genuinely means everything to see how far a story can go. Now, let's get back to Adelaide. The advertisement was 11 lines long. Silas Mercer had rewritten it 4 times before finally walking it to the post office in town, and even then he almost turned around twice on the road back. 11 lines felt like too much and not enough simultaneously, which was exactly how everything in his life had felt for the past 4 years. Rancher, 38, widower, Northern Frontier Territory. Seeks practical woman, capable of hard work, comfortable with isolation, willing to manage household accounts. Affection not guaranteed. Stability offered. Respond to Box 14, Blackthorn Ridge. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't going to lie about what he had to offer either. His foreman, a leathery old man named Dub, who had worked the ranch since before Silas's hair started going gray at the temples, read the advertisement over his shoulder without being invited to do so and said, "You forgot to mention you're half-deaf when you're thinking hard and you leave your coffee cups everywhere." Nobody's marrying my coffee cups, just saying a woman ought to know what she's walking into. Silas folded the paper and put it in his chest pocket. She'll figure it out. He didn't expect many responses. He expected fewer that were serious. What he did not expect, what genuinely surprised him enough that he had to set down his morning coffee and read the letter a second time, was a response written in handwriting so precise it looked like it had been typeset. From a woman who had not once asked about his appearance, his financial standing beyond what was practical, or whether the ranch house had curtains. She asked about the water source. She asked whether the soil held clay or loam. She asked how far the nearest town was and whether the road flooded in spring. He wrote back the same afternoon, which was something he hadn't done for anyone in years. Her name was Adelaide Veynor, and she arrived on a Wednesday. Silas was at the fence line when the stagecoach rolled through the dust, which meant he had about 4 minutes of watching before she could see his face clearly enough to read anything on it. He used those 4 minutes poorly. He stood there with one boot on the lower fence rail, like a man who had completely forgotten what to do with his own body, watching a woman in a gray traveling dress climb down from the coach with a leather bag that was, without question, too small for everything a person needed to start a new life. She didn't look around the way most people looked around when they arrived in Blackthorn Ridge, that slow, deflating scan that ended with a barely concealed expression of "this is it." She looked at the road behind the stagecoach, then at the ridgeline north of town, then at the water tower near the livery stable, and then at him, all in about 4 seconds. The way a person looked around when they were checking for things, not admiring them. Silas stepped off the fence and walked toward her. She was younger than he'd pictured. That was the first thing he noticed, though he told himself immediately that it was none of his business. The second thing he noticed, and this one he genuinely tried not to notice, and failed, was that she was beautiful in the way that made a man suddenly and uncomfortably aware of his own worn jacket, his calloused hands, the dust on his boots that he hadn't thought about once until this exact moment. He cleared his throat. "Miss Veynor, Mr. Mercer," her voice was even. Not warm, not cold level, the way someone spoke when they had learned to control what their voice revealed. She extended her hand the way a businesswoman might, not waiting for him to offer his first. "Thank you for meeting me. Wagon's over here." Not his finest conversational moment. But she didn't seem bothered by it. She followed him without asking where the wagon was, which he appreciated. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes on a good day, and this was not a good day because the South Trail had developed a new rut that sent the wagon lurching sideways, hard enough that Adelaide grabbed the sideboard without making a sound about it. Most people commented on the road. She said nothing, just straightened back up and looked at the creek they were crossing. "Does it run all year?" she asked. "Usually dries to a trickle in August. Picks back up by October. What do you do for water in August?" "Well, we got a cistern behind the how large." He looked at her sideways. 1,200 gallons. She was quiet for a moment, calculating something he wasn't part of. "That's tight if you're running cattle through the summer. Have you considered extending the east channel to catch runoff from the northern ridge?" Silas held the reins and said nothing for a full 5 seconds. "I have not," he finally said. "I noticed the ridge grade when we came through. The slope would work in your favor." She wasn't bragging. She said it the same way she might have said, "The sky looks like rain, matter of fact, just information being shared. I could look at it properly once I've seen the whole property." He said, "All right," what he thought was considerably more complicated. The ranch house was not much to look at, and Silas had spent zero time worrying about that before Adelaide arrived and was now, for some reason, extremely aware of it as he pushed open the front door and let her walk in ahead of him. The kitchen was clean because Dub's wife had come over 2 days ago and forced the issue, but the shelves were still half organized in that particular bachelor way, where things were findable to exactly one person and incomprehensible to everyone else. Adelaide set her bag down near the door, not in a bedroom, not in a corner, near the door, and walked into the kitchen like she was reading a map. She opened 2 cabinets. She ran her hand along one of the shelves. She looked at the account ledger sitting open on the kitchen table, the one Silas had been half-heartedly reconciling for 6 weeks. "May I?" she asked, gesturing at it. "Go ahead." She sat down and read through 3 pages in the time it would have taken Silas to read one. And her expression during this process was the expression of a woman who had found something in the back of the pantry that had gone very bad and was deciding how to address it without causing offense. "Mr. Mercer." "Silas is fine, Silas." She set the ledger down with a specific kind of careful that meant she was controlling herself. "Your grain account hasn't been balanced since March. You've been overpaying the feed store by approximately $9 a month for at least 2 years. The number landed in his chest like a small stone. "I'm aware the accounts have gotten $216, she said. "Roughly, if it's been 2 years. He sat down across from her. "I've been managing the ranch alone. I understand." And she did seem to understand, which somehow made it worse than if she'd been judgmental about it. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you what I can fix." She looked at him directly, none of that sideways, glancing some people did when they wanted to say something hard. "That's why I'm here, isn't it? To be useful." "Among other things," he said, which came out sounding stranger than he intended, and he looked away from her toward the window. She didn't push on the "among other things." She just opened the ledger again and picked up his pencil without asking if she could and started working. Silas stood up and went to check on the horses, which was what he did when he needed somewhere to put himself and couldn't think of a better option. That first week was one of the more disorienting experiences of Silas's adult life, and he had buried a wife, so the bar was not low. Adelaide reorganized the kitchen on day 2 not dramatically, not in a way that made him feel pushed out of his own home, but quietly and systematically, so that on day 3 when he reached for where the tin of coffee had always been, it was 6 inches to the left, and he couldn't even argue with the placement because it made more logical sense there. She fixed the broken hinge on the root cellar door, which had been sticking for 8 months and which he'd genuinely stopped noticing. She balanced the ledger completely in 4 days, and left it on the table with a single piece of paper tucked inside that listed 5 other accounts she believed were worth reviewing. She didn't announce these things. She just did them and left evidence of them and waited to see if he would say anything. He said nothing, mostly because he didn't know what to say. "Thank you" felt insufficient. "You've upended a decade of my habits in 4 days" felt too revealing. What he kept thinking about and trying not to think about was the bag near the door. It hadn't moved. She'd taken things from it, presumably, because she had clearly changed clothes and had whatever personal items a woman needed. But the bag itself remained beside the door like it had never been unpacked, and after 3 days he realized it wasn't laziness or forgetfulness. It was placement. She wanted it where she could reach it. He noticed other things too. The way she paused every single time someone in town called her Mrs. Mercer just a half second, less than a breath. But there, a tiny recalibration. The way she tracked movement through the windows without appearing to. The way she'd asked, on day 2, how long it took to reach the South Road from the ranch house, and had filed his answer away with the focused attention of a woman who was calculating something that had nothing to do with ranch logistics. Silas was not a suspicious person by nature, but he was not an unobservant one either. And what he observed about Adelaide Veynor was a woman who had learned, somewhere and recently, to live like someone might come for her. He didn't ask. It wasn't his place yet, and possibly wasn't going to become his place. They had an arrangement, not a history, and he respected the difference, even if part of him, the part he kept firmly in its corner, was growing more curious about her by the day. Then the letter came. It arrived on a Thursday, which was the day the supply rider came through from the county seat with mail and dry goods, and Silas took the post at the gate as usual and carried it back to the house before looking at it. He sorted through 3 pieces of his own business correspondence before he reached the last one and stopped walking. The envelope was heavy stock. Not Blackthorn Ridge heavy stock, this was paper that cost something, cream-colored and thick, sealed with red wax impressed with an elaborate crest that Silas didn't recognize but could identify on sight as the kind of thing that only existed in households where the family had been important long enough to design symbols for themselves. The handwriting was precise and cold. It was addressed to Miss Adelaide Veynor. He stood at the fence gate holding it for probably 30 seconds longer than was necessary before he carried it inside. She was at the kitchen table with the ranch's water records, which she had apparently found in a box in the back of the storage room and had spread across the table in some organizational system that made sense to her. She looked up when he came in. He set the letter on top of the nearest paper. She looked at it the way someone looked at something they'd been expecting and dreading simultaneously. The blood in her face did something quiet and controlled. She didn't go pale dramatically. It was more like a subtle withdrawal, like a tide pulling back before anyone noticed. She picked it up. She read the name on it. She set it back down without opening it. "Adelaide," he said. "I know who it's from." Her voice was still level, still controlled. But the bag near the door suddenly made a different kind of sense, and the pauses after Mrs. Mercer, and the way she timed movement from the house to the creek and back like she was running route calculations in her head. "You want to tell me about it?" She looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether a person can be trusted, not because she doubted his honesty, he thought, but because she had learned that trust was a resource that had to be rationed carefully. "Not tonight," she said. He didn't push. He went back outside, and she stayed at the table with the letter sitting unopened in front of her. And when he came back in an hour later to wash his hands before supper, the letter was gone, and Adelaide was standing at the stove stirring something. Her back perfectly straight, her movements precise and calm, and the only thing that gave her away was that she was gripping the wooden spoon a little too tightly. They ate supper without talking much, which was actually not unusual for them, except that the silence that night was a different kind. It had weight to it. It had the specific texture of 2 people who are both waiting for something, and neither is ready to say what. She told him 2 days later, not because she had decided to trust him exactly, or maybe she had. Silas couldn't tell. She told him because she was practical, and practical people eventually recognized that protecting a secret required more resources than sharing it with one reliable person. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with her coffee going cold in front of her because she'd forgotten about it. Her father's name was Adelaide Veynor. The name meant something, she said. In the financial circles of the eastern cities, meant old money and new influence, and the particular kind of power that expressed itself through lawyers and paperwork rather than anything as honest as a direct threat. Conrad Bellamy was a business partner of her father's, 15 years her senior, twice divorced, and the kind of man who spoke about women the way someone spoke about investments, in terms of value, return, and what you could do with them if you managed them correctly. Her father had arranged the engagement, had in fact already communicated the engagement to social acquaintances before Adelaide had been formally told about it. He signed the agreement, she said, with my name. He signed it as my representative, which he believed he had the legal right to do. Did he? Not in any way I intended to honor. Her jaw was tight. I told him no, clearly and completely. He told me I was being emotional and would understand the practical value once I'd had time to consider. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The following week, he arranged a dinner with Conrad Bellamy at our house. Without telling me, presenting it as a fait accompli. Silas turned his coffee cup in a slow circle, so you left. I left. She said it simply. But there was an entire architecture of months behind those two words, months of moving, of careful planning, of covering tracks, of discovering that your father's influence reached further than you expected, and that being a woman with no husband and no male representative in a world that still required those things made every door harder to open. I found your advertisement, she said, because I was looking for a place that was far enough away and different enough from everything I came from that it wouldn't occur to anyone to look for me there. He thought about that, and then I turned out to be a real person. You turned out to be a real person, she agreed, and for just a moment the edge of her mouth shifted in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Which complicated things, I imagine it did. He looked at her. This letter is from my father, or his lawyers. Likely both. She set her cup down. Silas, I need you to understand something. My father has money and patience and men who do what he pays them to do. I don't think you understood what you were agreeing to when you wrote to the agency, and I don't think it's fair to hold you to that without. Stop, he said it quietly, not sharply. Just once, and she stopped. He looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I need you to answer me straight. She waited. Is this what we have here? This arrangement, is it something you want? Or is Blackthorn Ridge just the best option you had at the time? The question seemed to land differently than she expected. She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression that was hard to name, not calculation, not guile, but something genuine working its way through to the surface. Both, she said finally. Can it be both? He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said, I suppose it can. He stood up and carried his cup to the sink. If anyone comes onto this land asking about you, he said, with his back to her, running water, I'm going to tell them you're not here. If they push past that, I'm going to give them one more chance to turn around and ride out. After that, it's their problem, not mine. He turned off the tap. You're not going anywhere you don't choose to go. That's the only other thing I want you to understand. Adelaide sat at the kitchen table looking at the back of this man, this quiet, worn, unexpectedly solid man, and said nothing for a long moment. All right, she said at last, and something in her posture just slightly shifted. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief and more complicated. Like a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just been offered for the first time the possibility of setting it down. 2 days later, a rider appeared at the gate. He was well dressed for Blackthorn Ridge. which meant he looked entirely wrong for Blackthorn Ridge clean coat, expensive boots, a hat that hadn't been worn in weather. He sat his horse the way men sat horses when riding was a professional requirement rather than a daily reality, and he looked at the ranch house with the patient, measuring expression of someone who had been sent to find something and was deciding the most efficient way to get it. Silas walked out to meet him alone. His name, he said, was Roderick Vale. He was looking for a young woman, he said, on behalf of her family, who were very concerned for her safety and well-being. Silas stood in the midday dust listening to this and kept his face entirely neutral. Her family, Roderick Vale said, simply wanted to know she was safe. Silas looked at him for 3 full seconds before he answered. Woman by that name came through Blackthorn Ridge, he said. 3 weeks ago. Took the westbound stage. It was the calmest lie he had ever told. And the most important one. Inside the house, Adelaide stood 6 feet from the window and did not move, and did not breathe until she heard the sound of a single horse riding back the way it came. Roderick Vale did not look back when he rode out. That was the thing Silas noticed most men, when they'd been told something they didn't entirely believe, look back at least once. A glance over the shoulder, checking whether the story still held at a distance. Roderick Vale rode straight down the south road without turning his head, which meant one of 2 things. Either he believed the lie completely, or he was disciplined enough not to show that he didn't. Silas stood at the gate until the dust settled back onto the road and there was nothing moving in either direction. Then he walked back to the house. Adelaide was still standing near the window when he came in. She'd moved, she was at the kitchen table now, both hands flat on the surface, her weight forward on them, like she needed something solid to press against. She looked at him when he came through the door and said nothing, which was how he knew she'd heard everything. He's gone, Silas said. For now. She straightened up. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles, where her hands had been pressing against the table, were still white. Roderick Vale is not the kind of man my father sends once. He's the kind my father sends until he comes back with an answer. What kind of answer does your father usually get? The one he paid for. Silas took off his hat and set it on the hook by the door. He went to the stove and found the coffee still warm from this morning and poured himself a cup that he didn't particularly want because it gave him something to do with his hands while he thought. Then we'll be ready for him when he comes back, he said. Adelaide looked at him the way she'd been looking at him more frequently in the past week, that particular expression that was somewhere between assessment and something she hadn't named yet. Like she was continuously revising an equation about him, and the numbers kept coming out different than expected. You lied to him, she said. Easily. I told him what he needed to hear. He knows you're lying, Silas. Probably. He drank the coffee. It was lukewarm and slightly burnt, which was what happened when you left coffee on the stove through a mid-morning crisis. Knowing and proving are different problems. He's got no proof, no witness, and a long ride back to wherever he came from to think about whether it's worth pushing the issue. And when he decides it is, then we deal with it. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the shape of one, without any humor in it. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, but it's manageable. He set the cup down. There's a difference. Adelaide moved to the window not to look out, he realized, but to put her back against something solid while she thought. She did that. He'd noticed it early on, the way she always found walls and corners and positions that limited what could come up behind her. He'd thought at first it was just a woman being cautious in a strange place. He understood now it was older than that, worn into her the way a habit got worn in when the alternative had consequences. I've been managing alone for 8 months, she said. Moving every few weeks, changing names when I had to. My father has lawyers in 4 cities and men in 6 more, she paused. I'm not saying this to frighten you. I'm saying it so you understand what you've involved yourself in. You deserve to know the full weight of it. Appreciate that. He looked at her. You done? She blinked. I knew there was a weight to it when I made the decision, he said. didn't need the full accounting to make the call. I made the call because it was the right one. He picked up his hat from the hook again. Now I've got fence line to check on the east side. Might be back late. He was out the door before she could respond, which was deliberate, because he was not entirely sure what would come out of his own mouth if he kept standing in that kitchen with her, looking at him like that. And some things were better addressed through physical labor than conversation. The fence line didn't need checking. He checked it anyway, thoroughly, for 2 hours, and came back slightly calmer. The problem with Adelaide and Silas understood, this was not a problem with Adelaide specifically, but a problem with himself, which was its own kind of aggravation, was that she was not what he had asked for and not what he'd prepared himself for. And he had no good framework for what to do about that. He'd asked for a practical woman. She was practical, more thoroughly practical than anyone he'd met in years. But she was also 26 and sharp as a new blade and beautiful in a way that had the specific quality of being completely uninterested in being noticed, which somehow made it worse, because a woman who knew she was beautiful and worked it was something he could have categorized and kept at a useful distance. Adelaide appeared to have genuinely no investment in how she looked, which meant her looks were just there, factual and unmanaged, and he had nowhere to put them in his mental accounting. He'd asked for someone who expected little affection. She appeared to expect nothing from him personally, which should have been exactly what he wanted and was instead, paradoxically, the thing that made him think about her most. He'd asked for someone who could tolerate isolation. She'd grown up in the isolation she'd built herself because the alternative was worse. And she carried that solitude the way you carried something you'd learned to live with rather than something you chose. And he knew that particular weight intimately enough that recognizing it in her felt uncomfortably like looking in a mirror. Dub found him renailing a fence post that didn't need renailing on the east boundary and leaned on the fence rail and watched him for a while without saying anything, which was Dub's particular method of communicating that he had something to say and was waiting for an invitation. Silas drove another nail. "Man came to the gate this morning," Dub said eventually. "I handled it," I noticed. Dub worked a piece of dry grass between his teeth. Fella like that doesn't come out to Blackthorn Ridge without a good reason. He had a reason. It didn't pan out. Another pause. "Mrs. Mercer doing all right?" Silas stopped hammering. He turned and looked at Dub, who looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who was asking something simple on the surface and something considerably more complicated underneath. "She's fine," Silas said. "She's something, that's certain." Dub said it plainly, no edge to it. "Ellie says she's never seen a woman reorganize a ledger that fast. Says it gave her a headache just watching." Dub's wife Ellie had come around twice since Adelaide's arrival, ostensibly with food, actually to form an opinion. Ellie's opinions were reliable, and she didn't waste them on people who weren't worth the effort. And the fact that she'd come around twice and made the ledger comment, rather than any of the several more predictable comments about the age gap or the circumstances, told Silas something. "She's capable," he said, "more than." Dub spit out the piece of grass. "You tell her she can have Ellie if she wants company. Get lonely out here for a woman not used to it. She's used to more isolation than you'd think." "That's so." Dub looked at the horizon in the way that meant he was deciding whether to continue. He continued, "Silas, don't. I'm not doing anything. You're about to give me advice I didn't ask for. I'm about to ask you one question, which is different from advice." Dub turned to face him. "When's the last time you let yourself want something? Not needed. Not managed, wanted." The question sat between them in the afternoon air like a stone dropped in still water. Silas picked up his hammer. "Fence isn't going to fix itself," he said. Dub snorted and walked away, which was as close to "I'll leave it there" as Dub ever got, and Silas stood at the fence line alone for another few minutes before he admitted to himself, in the private accounting of his own head, that he didn't have an answer for the question. That night he woke at 2 in the morning. This was not unusual. Sleep had been its own complicated negotiation. Since Lenora died, some nights it held through till dawn. Other nights it cut loose early and left him lying in the dark with his thoughts and no good company for them. He lay still for a minute and then sat up and pulled on his pants and went to the kitchen for water. Adelaide was sitting at the kitchen table. She had a lamp lit low and the unopened letter from her father in front of her, and she was looking at it the way someone looked at something they knew they had to deal with and hadn't yet figured out how. She was in her house robe, her dark hair loose, and she had a glass of water in her hand that had been sitting there long enough to leave a ring on the table. She looked up when he came in and didn't seem particularly surprised to see him, which told him she'd been awake long enough that she'd gotten past the point of startling at noises. "Can't sleep," he said, because it was obvious, and sometimes obvious was the least harmful option. "Not particularly." She looked back at the letter. "I've been trying to decide whether to open it. What's stopping you?" "Once I know what it says, I have to respond to knowing it." He understood that. He'd had his own version of that problem for 4 years, things he hadn't opened, rooms he hadn't entered, truths he hadn't looked at directly, because the looking required something of him he wasn't sure he had. He got his water and sat down across from her, not too close, just at the table. "You don't have to," he said. "Open it. I know that." She turned the envelope over in her hands. "But not opening it is a decision too. It's just a slower one." Opened it. He watched her read it. He couldn't see the words, but he could see her face, and what moved across it was controlled, measured. Careful, the face of a woman who had learned to process difficult things in private and was now processing one in company for what was possibly the first time, and was not entirely sure how to manage the overlap. When she finished, she set the letter down on the table and looked at it for a moment. "He's hired a legal firm," she said. "They've drawn up a document arguing that my departure constitutes abandonment of a valid contractual agreement and that I owe damages." She paused. "Conrad Bellamy." Silas stared at her. "Your father is trying to sue you for not marrying a man you never agreed to marry." Essentially. Her voice was flat. "The legal argument is creative. I'll give them that. It's not going to hold. It doesn't have to hold. It has to be expensive enough and complicated enough that I can't fight it alone." She folded the letter and set it down. "That's how my father operates. He doesn't have to win in court. He just has to make the alternative more costly than compliance." Silas sat with that for a minute. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing something to the loose board on the north side of the barn, that rhythmic tapping that he'd been meaning to fix for 6 weeks and hadn't. He listened to it and thought, "Do you have your own money?" he asked. "Some. Not enough for a prolonged legal fight." She looked at him directly. "Are you asking whether I'm a financial liability?" "I'm asking because if you have money, we need to know where it stands and what can be done with it." "That's a practical question, not a criticism." She seemed to recalibrate. "I have enough to live on for 6 months if I'm careful. An inheritance from my grandmother that my father never managed to access because she was smarter than him and put it in trust." She paused. "He doesn't know the amount. He may not know it exists. Then we keep it that way." Silas turned his water glass slowly on the table. "Here's what I know. We're in Blackthorn Ridge, which is not a city with lawyers on every corner. The county recorder knows me, and the county sheriff has worked this territory for 20 years and doesn't care much for city men coming in with paperwork they expect to enforce on his patch. You're saying geography is a defense. I'm saying distance and inconvenience have legal value that people with money sometimes forget about." He looked at her. "Your father expected you to run and keep running. The one thing he probably hasn't prepared for is you stopping." Adelaide was quiet for a long time, long enough that the lamp flame flickered once and settled. "He called me foolish," she said, not with emotion, just reporting it, like a fact from the letter. In the letter, he said I was being foolish and sentimental, and that Conrad Bellamy was a reasonable man who would make reasonable allowances for my— She paused, and the next word came out with a delicate, precise contempt temperament. Given time. He used the word temperament. My father believes that women who object to arrangements have temperaments rather than objections. She picked up her water glass and drank from it. It's one of his more consistent qualities. Silas looked at her across the table in the low lamplight and said, "What do you want, Adelaide? Not what you need to do, not the practical answer. What do you actually want?" She looked at him with that look again, the recalculating one, the one where the numbers kept coming out different. "I want to be left alone," she said. "I want to not have to think about whether someone is going to come through a door looking for me. I want to work without it feeling temporary." She stopped. "And I want the north drainage fixed, because the current system is going to cost you a full season's yield in another 2 years, and that bothers me more than it probably should." He held her gaze for just a moment. "Then we'll fix the drainage," he said. "And the rest of it." In that order, she almost smiled. Not quite, but close. In the weeks that followed, the ranch reached a kind of equilibrium that Silas hadn't experienced in years. Not comfort exactly. Comfort was too soft a word for what the two of them produced together, which was more like a productive friction. Two people with strong opinions about different things occupying the same space and occasionally colliding in ways that resolved into something functional. The drainage project started on a Thursday in early September, which was Adelaide's choice of timing, because she'd been watching the cloud patterns and determined the weather window would hold for 10 days. Silas hired 2 men from town to do the heavy digging, and Adelaide directed the layout herself, with a hand level and a marked rope and a patience for the men's questions that surprised Silas until he realized she'd simply decided these men were worth educating rather than managing. She was good with people when she chose to engage them, which she hadn't done much in the first weeks. He watched her talk to the 2 hired hands and explain the grade differential and the catch basin design, and both men nodded with the particular nod of someone who didn't fully understand the math, but completely understood that the woman explaining it knew what she was doing. Dub came by on the second day and watched for a while, and then said to Silas quietly, "She's going to double your water retention by spring." "She knows it," Silas said. "You need to tell her." "She already knows. Tell her it matters." Dub gave him a look. "There's a difference between knowing you're capable and having someone acknowledge it. You, of all people, ought to understand that." Silas didn't answer, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. And that evening, when the hired men had gone, and Adelaide was washing up at the pump in the yard, he came out and stood nearby and said, "The drainage layout is good. Better than I'd have figured on my own." She wrung out the cloth she'd been using and didn't look at him immediately. "I know, I'm saying it matters. To the ranch." He stopped, recalibrated. "It matters." She looked at him then. Something shifted in her expression, small, private, quickly contained. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was Adelaide, "You should also reconfigure the west cistern overflow." "I've been thinking about it." "Of course you have. The current lip is 6 inches too high. You're losing water every time it rains hard. Can we fix one thing at a time? We can fix multiple things simultaneously if we plan correctly." He walked back to the barn, making a sound that was not quite a laugh. And behind him he heard her make the same sound. And it was the first time he'd heard that from her, that small, unguarded thing, and he carried it around with him for the rest of the evening like something fragile he didn't want to break. The second visitor arrived on a Saturday. This one was different from Roderick Vale in every way that mattered. Where Vale had been polished, this man was plain. Where Vale had been careful, this man was direct. He came up the main road in the early afternoon without any apparent attempt at subtlety. A heavy-set man in a brown coat, with a folded document in his breast pocket, and the manner of someone who delivered documents professionally and had learned not to have feelings about where they landed. He said his name was Hatch. He said he was a process server from the county seat, and he was looking for a woman named Adelaide Veynor regarding a civil matter. Silas was at the water trough when Hatch rode up, and he straightened up slowly and turned around and looked at the man with no expression. "No one here by that name," he said. Hatch looked at him with the patient, practiced look of a man who heard that sentence regularly. The woman would have arrived by stagecoach in the last month or two. Brown-haired, gray-eyed, traveling alone. A lot of women travel through here. Not many with that description I'd expect in a town this size. I got a wife, Silas said. Adelaide Mercer. She's brown-haired. Beyond that, I couldn't tell you she matches your description because I don't look at my wife and catalog her characteristics. Hatch blinked. This was apparently not an answer he'd prepared for. I'd need to speak with your wife directly, he said. You'd need a better reason than you've given me. Silas stepped forward slowly, not aggressively, just closing the distance enough to change the dynamic. Process server from the county seat coming to a private ranch in Blackthorn Ridge to serve papers on a woman my size and class of property doesn't add up. You want to tell me who's behind this filing? Hatch hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that hesitation was enough. The filing party prefers to remain, then the filing party can remain elsewhere. Silas met the man's eyes. This is private land. You've delivered no valid documentation. You have no sheriff's accompaniment. You've told me the name of the subject and received my answer that she is not here. In the county I grew up in, that's the end of the interaction. Hatch looked at him for a long moment. Then he folded the document back into his pocket. Good afternoon, he said, and turned his horse around. Silas stood in the yard until the man was off his property, and then he went directly inside and found Adelaide at the kitchen table again. She was always at the kitchen table. He thought. That table had become the center of everything that mattered in this house, and he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Process server, he said, civil filing. She closed the account book she'd been working in. She didn't look surprised. My father moved faster than I expected. He can't enforce anything out here without a county court order. He'd need a local judge to agree to it, and the judge in this county is not a man who takes well to city lawyers telling him what his territory requires. You know the judge. I've brought him a deer every November for 12 years. Adelaide looked at him with an expression that was something between disbelief and genuine appreciation. You think venison is a legal strategy. I think 12 years of being a decent neighbor is a legal strategy. The venison is just the evidence. She pressed her lips together. He could see her trying not to smile and mostly succeeding. That's actually not the worst logic I've ever heard. High praise. Don't push it. He leaned back in his chair. There's going to be more of them, Adelaide. Your father's not going to stop at a process server. No, she folded her hands on the table. He's going to escalate. He always does. Whatever barrier you create, he finds a way to make the cost of maintaining it higher than the cost of giving in. She paused. That's his method. Not force, attrition. Then we don't wear down. She looked at him steadily. You understand you're saying we. I'm aware of what I said, because when I arrived here, this was a practical arrangement with clear terms. You asked for a capable woman to manage a household. I agreed to manage one. That was the boundary. Boundaries move, he said. When circumstances change, what circumstances have changed? He looked at her across the kitchen table in the gray afternoon light. This woman who checked exits and kept her bag packed and had taught herself to live braced for the moment everything ran out from under her. And he said, You stop treating this like a temporary arrangement. She went still. I watch you, he said, and he said it carefully, not wanting it to land wrong. Not the way you watch the road. I watch how you work. You don't work like someone who's planning to leave. You fixed that cellar hinge. Nobody fixes a hinge they expect someone else to deal with later. You memorized where the water runs in every corner of this property. You don't memorize things you're not planning to stay long enough to use. Adelaide was very quiet for a long moment. Outside, the loose board on the barn knocked against the siding in the wind, and somewhere in the distance a horse moved in the paddock, and the house held the particular silence of a place waiting for someone to say something true. I didn't mean to, she said finally. Start thinking of it that way. I know. It happened slowly, and I didn't notice until it had already happened. I know that too. She looked at him. What are you saying, Silas? He was quiet for a moment, turning over the answer with the care of a man who had learned the cost of saying things badly. I'm saying that when your father's next man comes, he said, I want him to have to deal with a real marriage, not a practical arrangement. Whatever your father has planned, the most direct answer to it is the one he can't argue with in any court in any city. Adelaide stared at him. I'm not asking because I'm afraid of your father, he said. And I'm not asking out of obligation. I'm asking because somewhere between the drainage project and the coffee cups and the ledger you fixed, and you telling me that the West Cistern overflow is wrong. He stopped. Started again. I'm asking because this stopped feeling temporary to me too. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. This one had something alive in it. You have terrible timing, Adelaide said. I know. We're potentially being pursued by a man with legal firms in 4 cities. I'm aware this is not a romantic moment, no, he agreed. Practical one, which is how most things work out between us. She looked at him for a long time with that expression he'd been learning. To read the one that meant the calculation that something had come out different than she'd put in. And then she said quietly, with none of the evenness she usually kept in her voice, Ask me properly, then, if you're going to ask. He looked at her across the table. Adelaide Veynor, he said, will you make this a real marriage? Not protection, not paperwork. An actual choice. She held his gaze. I haven't decided yet, she said. He nodded. Fair enough. But I'm not saying no. That's enough for now. She picked up her pen and went back to the account book, and he went back out to fix the board on the barn that had been knocking all afternoon, and neither of them mentioned it again that day. But the air in the house had changed in some way that was hard to name and impossible to ignore. 3 days after that, Roderick Vale came back. He was better prepared this time. He rode in with a second man, younger, who stayed back near the gate with his horse while Vale came forward, and Vale's face this time had dropped the polished manners down to something more direct. He'd been given new instructions, Silas guessed. The patient approach hadn't produced results, and Adelaide Veynor was adjusting his method. Mr. Mercer, Vale said, I'm going to be straightforward with you. All right, we know Adelaide Veynor is here. We have a witness from the stagecoach that she disembarked in Blackthorn Ridge and did not reboard. We have a record from the marriage agency that she wrote to in response to your advertisement. He paused. The woman you've registered with the county as your wife is Adelaide Veynor. Her father is prepared to contest the legality of that marriage in county court on the grounds that she entered it fraudulently while fleeing a prior contractual obligation. Silas stood in the yard and let Vale finish. Mr. Mercer, Vale said, the simplest resolution here is for Adelaide to return home with me. No legal filing, no court proceedings. Her father simply wants his daughter back. Does he? Silas said. He's concerned for her. Silas looked at the man at the gate, then back at Vale. Here's the thing about what you've just said. She's not running. She's standing on her own land. If her father wants to contest the marriage in county court, he's welcome to make that trip, his lawyers. And explain to Judge Colby Herrenworth, who I have had supper with on 6 occasions, exactly why a legal marriage between 2 consenting adults in this county should be unwound because some city businessman is disappointed. He took a step forward. And when he's done explaining that, I'm going to explain that my wife never signed any document agreeing to marry Conrad Bellamy, that the signature on that agreement was placed there by her father without her authorization or knowledge, and that any court prepared to hear that case will also be hearing a fraud argument from our side before the week is out. Vale's expression had gone careful. Furthermore, Silas said, the man you brought to the gate is trespassing on private property, and if he doesn't turn around in the next 30 seconds, I'm going to ask him to do so in a less conversational tone. He held Vale's eyes. You've told me what Adelaide Veynor is prepared to do. I'm telling you what I'm prepared to do. Go back and let him do the arithmetic. Vale stood very still for a moment. Then he turned, clicked at his horse, and rode to the gate, and both men rode out without looking back. Silas went inside. Adelaide was standing in the middle of the kitchen, not near the window, not with her back to the wall. Just standing in the center of the room, looking at him when he walked through the door with the expression of someone who had heard every word through the walls of the house and was still in the process of absorbing them. "You said fraud," she said, "because it is fraud. You'd have to prove it. In court, I'd have to make it credible enough that it costs more to pursue than to abandon." He hung his hat up. "Which is the same principle your father uses, just applied in the other direction." She looked at him for a long moment. "You said our side," she said. "I did." Another silence, this one longer than the others. "Yes," she said. He looked up. "To what you asked," she said. 3 days ago. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were direct, and she stood in the center of the room like a woman who had decided to stop keeping one foot aimed at the door. "Yes, a real marriage. An actual choice." She paused. "My choice." The kitchen was very quiet. "All right," Silas said. "That's all you've got to say? I also think you're right about the west cistern overflow." She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, and then Adelaide Veynor laughed a real laugh, sudden and unpracticed and entirely unguarded. The kind a person made when they weren't expecting it from themselves, and it moved through the quiet kitchen and the quiet house and out into the air of Blackthorn Ridge, like something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. Silas stood in his kitchen listening to it, and felt, for the first time in 4 years, like the house was something other than a place he'd taught himself to survive. He didn't say anything. Some things didn't need the addition. Adelaide's laugh faded the way real laughter did not abruptly, but in stages, trailing off into something quieter and almost surprised, like she hadn't expected to find that particular sound still inside her after so many months of careful silence. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, not embarrassed exactly, but recalibrating the way a person did when they'd shown more than they intended. Silas had already turned toward the stove, giving her the privacy of not being looked at while she recovered herself, which was one of those small things he did without making a production of it. She'd noticed that about him in the past weeks. He understood when not to watch. "The cistern can wait until next week," he said, his back still to her. "We've got the east drainage to finish first." "The east drainage is 70% complete," she said. Her voice was back to its usual level, but the edges of it were softer than they'd been an hour ago. "We can start the cistern Thursday. You plan to argue about everything we do on this ranch." "I plan to be correct about everything we do on this ranch, which is different." He poured himself water from the jug and didn't respond. But his shoulders had a different quality than usual, less held in, somehow, like something had quietly let go in the architecture of him. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after that, looking at the account book still open on the table, at the letter from her father folded in the corner, at the ordinary objects of an ordinary room that had somehow, without her fully authorizing the process, started to feel like hers. Then she sat back down and picked up her pen and went back to work, because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do, and because the numbers on the page were honest in a way that most things weren't, and they asked nothing of her except accuracy. The week that followed had a different texture than the weeks before it. Not because anything dramatic had changed. Silas was still quiet most mornings and territorial about his tools, and inclined to solve problems through labor rather than discussion. Adelaide was still precise and occasionally relentless, and moved through the ranch as though she was mentally redesigning it. They still argued about the west cistern overflow. They still ate supper mostly in silence except for the practicalities of the day, and they still occupied the house in that careful way of people who were calibrating the distance between them. But something had shifted in the calibration. It was in small things. The way he now left her coffee cup on the left side of the stove rather than the right, because he'd noticed, without saying so, that she reached left. The way she stopped filing her daily ranch notes at the far end of the table and moved them to the center, within his easy reach, because she'd noticed without saying so that he read them. The way they'd started ending up in the same room in the evening, without planning to, not talking, not performing domesticity, just being in proximity in a way that had gone from accidental to deliberate without either of them naming the transition. Dub noticed. Of course Dub noticed. He had the specific observational talent of a man who had worked for someone long enough to know the difference between how that person moved when they were alone and how they moved when they weren't. He didn't say anything directly, which was one of his better qualities. He just stopped looking at Silas with that particular version of quiet concern he'd been carrying around for the past 4 years. It was Ellie who said something, and Ellie said it to Adelaide. In the yard on a Wednesday afternoon when she'd come by with a jar of put-up tomatoes from her garden and ended up staying 2 hours because Ellie stayed 2 hours everywhere as a matter of personal philosophy. "You look different," Ellie said. She was a broad-shouldered woman with gray-streaked hair and the direct manner of someone who had lived through enough that she no longer saw the point in approaching things sideways. Adelaide was repairing a section of the paddock fence with a method she'd worked out that was marginally more efficient than how Silas had been doing it. Different how. Less like you're standing on a dock watching for a ship. Adelaide kept her eyes on the fence post. Was it that obvious? "Honey, you arrived here looking like a woman who'd been running since Tuesday and wasn't sure when Thursday was going to show up and finish her off." Ellie set the jar down on the fence rail. "I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying you don't look that way anymore." Adelaide was quiet for a moment, turning a nail between her fingers. "His last wife," she said. "Lenora, what was she like?" Ellie considered this with the care it deserved, rather than rushing an answer. "Gentle," she said, which isn't a word I use as a criticism. She was gentle the way some people are strong. It was just her nature, and she'd made peace with it. Loved that man in the particular way where you could see it from across a room without them doing anything noticeable. Did she know the ranch? She knew Silas. The ranch was his territory. They had a good division. Ellie paused. "You're different from her, if that's what you're working around to asking." "I wasn't asking that. You were thinking it." Adelaide couldn't argue with that because she had been, in the indirect way she thought about things she wasn't ready to look at directly. Not with jealousy. Jealousy would have required a confidence she hadn't yet earned, but with something more complicated. The awareness that she was occupying a space that had belonged to someone else, in a life that had been shaped around someone else, and that the shape of it didn't always fit her cleanly. "Different isn't wrong," Ellie said. He needed different. He just didn't know it. She picked up her jar. "I'll bring the second one next week." "The tomatoes are still coming in." She started toward the gate and then stopped, because Ellie always stopped, once before she left, having remembered the last thing. The locked room. Adelaide went still. "You know about it?" she said. "Everyone who's known Silas more than 2 years knows about it." Ellie's voice was matter-of-fact but not careless. "He locked it the week after Lenora died and hasn't opened it since. Won't talk about why. Won't talk about her much at all." She looked at Adelaide steadily. "I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you because if you stay, and it sounds like you're planning to, you're going to run up against that room eventually. And what's in there, it's not just furniture." Adelaide looked at the house. "I know," she said quietly. Ellie nodded once and left, and Adelaide stood at the fence for a while after the sound of the wagon had faded, looking at the house and thinking about locked doors and what it cost a person to keep them that way. She didn't do anything about it that day or the next. Filed the information the way she filed things she wasn't ready to act on carefully, in the back of her mind, where she could reach it when the moment was right. The moment came on a Thursday evening, later than she expected, and arrived not through any plan she'd made, but through a mistake she made without meaning to. She'd been looking for the supply invoices from August, which Silas kept in no system that she could identify, which was a source of ongoing low-grade frustration between them. She'd searched the kitchen shelves, the desk in the main room, the box in the storage closet, and had worked her way to the back of the house in that state of mild irritation that comes from looking for something you know exists but cannot find. and she tried the handle of a door at the end of the hallway before she realized which door it was. Didn't open. The handle turned about a quarter inch and met the resistance of a lock. She stood in the hallway, holding the handle she'd already turned, understanding immediately what she'd done, and took her hand off it as though the wood were hot. Behind her, Silas's boot fell on the hallway floor. She turned. He was standing 6 feet back, carrying a lantern because the back of the house was dim in the evening, and his face when he looked at the door and then at her was something she'd never seen on him before, not anger, not grief exactly. Just an expression of such naked exposure that she almost looked away out of instinct. "I was looking for the August invoices," she said immediately. "I didn't know. I know you weren't." His voice was flat but not hard. He looked at the door for a moment, then down at his boots, then somewhere in the middle distance between the two. "The invoices are in the kitchen desk, second drawer, back corner." All right, she didn't move, neither did he. The hallway held them both for a long, uncomfortable moment, and she was preparing to step around him and go back to the kitchen when he said, without looking at her, her name was Lenora Grace Mercer. She was 34 years old. She died of a chest fever in February, 4 years ago February, and she was sick for 11 days before she died, and I spent 8 of those days convinced she was going to get better. Adelaide stood very still. "I locked the room because I didn't know what else to do," he said. At first it felt like respect, like keeping something sacred. He paused. After a while I understood it wasn't respect. It was just not being able to. He finally looked at Adelaide, and his face had the quality of a man looking at something he's been avoiding long enough that looking had become its own kind of courage. "I haven't opened it. Not once. Haven't touched the handle. Until I touched it. Until you touched it." Something shifted in his expression, which is maybe not an accident, the way things go. Adelaide thought about what Ellie had said, about what was in that room not being just furniture. "You don't have to open it," she said. "I know that. But you think you should." He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the lantern flame shifted in some draft, and the hallway light moved around them. "I've been thinking," he said, "that I've been so careful about preserving what I lost that I stopped making anything new." He said it slowly, like someone working out the shape of a thought they'd had privately for a long time and hadn't yet put into language. "The ranch runs, the accounts they run now, because of you. The drainage will hold this spring. The cistern overflow will be fixed because you won't let that go until it is." A very slight thing crossed his face. "But I've been living in this house like I'm curating a museum. Like the whole point is to keep everything exactly as it was." "She wouldn't have wanted that," Adelaide said. Then immediately, "I'm sorry." "I didn't know her. I shouldn't." "No," he said. "You're probably right. She wasn't a woman who'd want this." He looked at the door. "She'd have told me I was being ridiculous about the 3rd week." Adelaide was quiet for a moment. "Open it," she said. Not as a command, just as a fact offered plainly. He looked at her. "Not for me," she said. "Not because it bothers me, or because I need the room, or because there's any practical reason that involves me at all. Open it for yourself, because what you've got locked in there is grief that's gone on long enough, and you know it, and the only thing keeping that door closed is you deciding it stays that way." Silas stood in the hallway for a long, still moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket and took out a key that had been there long enough that his fingers found it without looking a small brass thing, worn smooth on the teeth from years of being handled and put back unused. He held it for a moment in his palm. Then he stepped around Adelaide very carefully and stood in front of the door. She moved back, gave him the space of the hallway. He put the key in the lock. The mechanism turned with the specific resistance of something that had been closed a long time, a slight grinding, and then the door opened. And the room beyond it was dark and held the particular smell of closed spaces not bad, just still, like air that had been waiting. He stood in the doorway and reached in and found the lamp on the table beside the door by memory and lit it, and the room filled with the slow, warm light of it. Adelaide did not step forward to look. She stayed in the hallway and let him have the room. She heard him breathe, once the way a person breathed when something that had been heavy landed differently than they expected. He stood in the doorway for a long time. She couldn't see his face from where she stood, only his back, and the quality of his back in that moment was like watching someone stand in weather. When he finally stepped back out and pulled the door most of the way shut, not locked this time, just resting, he didn't say anything immediately. He stood in the hallway with the key still in his hand and looked at it like he was trying to remember what to do with it now that it had been used. "I'm going to leave it open," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, and he didn't seem bothered by the fact that she could hear that. The room, not because he stopped, just because it's time. "All right," Adelaide said. "Her things are in there." "I'm not moving them. I wouldn't ask you to. But the room isn't," he stopped again. This wasn't easy for him. He was a man who communicated most naturally through action, and this was one of those situations where action ran out and language became necessary, and language was hard work. "It doesn't have to be just her room," he said, "is what I'm saying." Adelaide understood that this was not a simple statement. It was the kind of thing a man said when he'd moved something large and necessary inside himself and was reporting it as plainly as he could. "I know," she said. He put the key in his vest pocket and picked up the lantern from where he'd set it on the hallway floor. He looked at her once, briefly, with the unguarded expression she'd seen on him only a handful of times, and then walked back toward the kitchen. She stood in the hallway for a moment longer, alone, looking at the door that was no longer locked. Then she went to find the August invoices, which were exactly where he said they were. The invoices turned out to be the smaller discovery of that evening, because when she spread them across the kitchen table and began cross-referencing them against the previous month's payments, she found something that had nothing to do with the room or Lenora or the careful new territory she and Silas were mapping together. She found a pattern. It was in the grain costs, specifically in the payments going to the Blackthorn Ridge feed store, and the pattern was not the accidental overpayment she'd already identified and corrected. This was something else, a subtle, regular inflation of invoice totals by small amounts, never large enough to catch at a glance, spread across 8 months and 3 different supply categories. If you added it up, and she had to add it 3 times before she trusted the number, someone had been skimming from Silas's accounts. Not a fortune, $40-some over 8 months. But $40 was real money in Blackthorn Ridge, and the method of it small increments, irregular timing. Different categories was the method of someone who understood accounting enough to know how to hide inside it. She sat at the kitchen table with the numbers in front of her until Silas came back through the kitchen on his way to the back door, and she said, "Silas." Something in her voice made him stop. She turned the invoice toward him and set her finger on a line. "This delivery," she said, $23.70. He leaned over and looked. "All right, your receipt for that delivery says $21.40. She slid a second paper beside the first. $2.30 difference. Not a rounding error, the numbers don't round to each other. She moved her finger to a second invoice. "This one, $16. Your copy says $14.50. She laid 3 more out in sequence. 8 months. 12 invoices, $43.80 total. Silas straightened up. His face had gone through something quiet and specific, not shock, because Silas didn't shock easily, but a cold settling of certainty, the kind a person showed when a thing they'd half suspected became confirmed. "The feed store," he said. "Someone at the feed store. Or the delivery man, or both." She looked up at him. "Have you changed suppliers recently? Any personnel changes you're aware of at the store?" New man took over the books there in January. His voice was flat. "Barton's boy came back from the city. Who handled the books before January?" "Barton himself. And the discrepancies start in February." She met his eyes. "I'm not certain it's him, but the timing fits." He stood very still for a moment, doing that thing he did where he was working through a problem in complete silence, and she'd learned to wait through it because the silence always ended with something useful. Can you document it cleanly, in a way that holds up to examination? I can document it so clearly that you could present it to the county sheriff and any reasonable man would understand it in 10 minutes. She paused. Is the county sheriff a reasonable man? On practical matters. More reliable than the average. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, and for the next 2 hours they worked through every invoice Adelaide could find. And she laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had grown up in a household where financial irregularities were serious matters requiring serious documentation, which, given Alistair Veynor's business dealings, she had. What they found wasn't only Barton's boy. There was a secondary thread, older, in the water rights fees, that pointed somewhere else entirely. Adelaide traced it backward through 3 years of records that Silas had kept but not reconciled, which was its own problem, and found a pattern going back to a county fee assessor who had since moved on to a different district. Gone now, Silas said when she identified the assessor. Gone, but the money isn't. She sat back and looked at the full table of documents they'd spread across the kitchen in the past 2 hours. The lamp had burned lower. The kitchen had gone cool. You've lost close to $300 over 3 years to 2 different people skimming from different parts of your accounts. She looked at him. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry you found it. I found it because your accounts were in a condition that made it possible to miss. I'm not criticizing managing a ranch alone as too much for one person. The accounts always go first, but if we go forward from here, you need to understand that I will be in these numbers regularly, and I will not always find pleasant things. I understand that. He looked at her across the table. Is that your way of saying you're committing to the accounts long term? It's my way of saying the accounts are in my care now, and I take that seriously. That's the same thing. She looked at him for a moment. Yes, she said, it is. He almost smiled. She was learning to catch the slight shift at the corner of his mouth, the brief softening around his eyes, the thing that came and went before it fully arrived. She was developing, without entirely intending to, a catalog of Silas Mercer's unexpressed expressions. She found this mildly alarming. The matter of Barton's boy went to the county sheriff 2 days later. Silas rode in with Adelaide's documentation, which she'd arranged with an index page, and cross-referenced annotations that she'd been told later made the sheriff say, "Who put this together?" And when Silas said "my wife," the sheriff had looked at it again with new appreciation. They didn't know the outcome for another week, because the sheriff was methodical and refused to move until he had his own corroboration. During that week, the ranch continued its ordinary business fence repair, cattle management, the ongoing drainage completion, and Silas and Adelaide moved through the work with the increasing efficiency of 2 people who had been calibrating to each other long enough that the calibration had become largely automatic. She still argued with him. He still walked out when the argument required physical processing rather than verbal. She still reorganized things in ways that briefly disoriented him and then turned out to be better, which he acknowledged through use rather than words. He still left coffee cups in locations that she found inexplicable and returned to the correct shelf without comment, which was itself a comment. But there were other things now. Mornings when she came into the kitchen, and he'd already started the stove, because he'd heard her moving in the house and knew she'd be there soon. Evenings when he came back from the north fence and stopped to look at whatever she was working on at the table before going to wash up, not reading it particularly, just present. Nights when the sound of him moving through the house in that particular pattern he had, when he couldn't sleep, made her feel less alone in her own wakefulness. She didn't examine these things too directly. They were better used than analyzed. The locked room, true to his word, stayed unlocked. She walked past the door daily, and the door stayed open an inch or two, not wide, just enough that air moved through it, and the room was no longer sealed. She did not go inside. That was his territory, and she understood the difference between a space that was healing and a space that was ready to be shared. He went in once that she saw late afternoon, a Friday, when she was outside at the cistern she'd talked him into beginning. She happened to look toward the house and saw him standing in the doorway of that room for a few minutes, then stepping inside, then coming back out. He didn't look stricken when he came outside later. He looked like a man who had done something necessary and found it survivable. She went back to the cistern measurements. On the 8th day after Silas submitted the documentation to the sheriff, something unexpected happened. Not from the sheriff's direction, from her father's. A third man arrived in Blackthorn Ridge, and this one was neither Vale's cultivated manner nor Hatch the process server's flat professionalism. This one came on a Thursday morning, and he went first to the town, not the ranch, and he spent 2 hours there before anyone thought to mention it to Silas. And by the time someone thought to mention it, Silas was already on his way back from the south pasture and arrived in town to find this man who gave his name as Prescott, and whose name meant nothing to anyone in Blackthorn Ridge, sitting in the sheriff's temporary office having what appeared to be a polite and extended conversation. Silas walked in without knocking because the sheriff's temporary office did not have a door worth knocking on. And the sheriff, a square man named Garrett Peel, who had been in this county so long that his voice had acquired the patience of territory, looked up from the conversation with the particular expression of someone who is not surprised by an interruption because they have been anticipating it. "Silas," Garrett said. "Garrett." Silas looked at the man named Prescott. He was 50-some years old, conservatively dressed, with the appearance of someone whose profession required being trusted in rooms where being trusted had high stakes. Lawyer or financier, the type was recognizable. "Who are you?" "My name is Edmund Prescott. I'm a legal representative of Adelaide Veynor, here regarding." "I know what you're here regarding." Silas looked at Garrett. "I'd appreciate knowing why you're meeting with him before telling me." "I was about to send for you," Garrett said, without sounding particularly apologetic. "Sit down, Silas. Mr. Prescott has brought a new filing, and I want you to hear it with me." Silas sat down. The filing was not what he expected. It was not another attempt to contest the marriage or serve civil papers on Adelaide. It was a petition for a county court hearing on the question of Adelaide's legal competency at the time of the marriage, arguing that she had been in a state of duress and reduced capacity that called into question her ability to consent. It took Silas about 15 seconds to understand what this was actually saying, and when he understood it, the blood in his chest did something cold and deliberate. They weren't going after the marriage's legality on contractual grounds anymore. They were going after Adelaide's mind. They were arguing that a woman who had run from an arranged marriage had done so due to instability, and that instability had followed her to Blackthorn Ridge and compromised her judgment. "That's not a legal argument," Silas said, and his voice was very level in the way it got when he was furious in containing it. "That's a slander. It's a legal petition," Prescott said, with the measured tone of a man who had delivered worse news and survived the rooms that followed. "It requests a hearing. In a hearing, evidence is presented, and—" "What evidence? What evidence does Adelaide Veynor have that his daughter was not in her right mind? The flight from a legal arrangement, the hasty marriage, the removal from her known social context." Prescott's voice was neutral and professional. "These are behaviors that, taken together, can be argued as indicators. These are behaviors of a woman who made a rational decision and executed it." Silas's voice had gone quiet in the particular way. Quiet got dangerous. "You are just describing independent judgment and calling it incapacity because it produced an outcome her father didn't choose." The silence in the room had a quality to it. Garrett Peel was looking at the petition with the expression of a man who was reaching conclusions about it privately and had not yet decided to share them. "Garrett," Silas said. "I'm reading," Garrett said. He read for another minute. Then he set the document down on his desk and folded his hands on top of it. "Mr. Prescott," he said, "I've been in this county for 22 years. I've heard a lot of legal filings in that time. Some of them were solid. Some of them were ambitious." He paused. "This one is going to require Mrs. Mercer to be present at any hearing in person for examination. That is standard in competency. In an examination where she will speak for herself, Garrett said, to a judge who has known her husband for a decade. In a town where she has been observed to be one of the more organized and capable people who've arrived in recent memory. He looked at Prescott evenly. I am not in the habit of prejudging filings, but I am in the habit of telling representatives what they're walking into so they can carry accurate information back to their employers. He stood up. Your filing will be received and scheduled. I'd suggest your employer think carefully about whether he wants his daughter to stand in front of a judge in this county and explain, in her own words, the full sequence of events that brought her here. Prescott looked at Garrett. Garrett looked back with 22 years of territory behind him. Prescott put on his hat. I'll convey your counsel, he said. He left. Silas sat in the chair across from Garrett for a moment after the door closed. They're trying to have her declared incompetent, he said. The words tasted like something bad. They're trying to use the threat of it, Garrett corrected. A man like Adelaide Veynor doesn't actually want a public hearing where his daughter testifies to what he did. He wants her afraid enough to comply before it gets to a courtroom. He looked at Silas. How is she? She's not afraid, Silas said, and then paused, revising. She's afraid. She just doesn't stop. Garrett nodded once, the nod of a man who recognized something. Then here's what you do. You go home and you tell her what happened in this room. All of it, without softening it. She needs to know exactly what she's dealing with. I know. And then you tell her that if this hearing proceeds, I will be making a personal recommendation to Judge Herrenworth about the circumstances and the character of the witnesses involved. Garrett picked up the filing again and looked at it with a distinct lack of fondness. A man who signs his daughter's name on a marriage contract without her knowledge and then argues she's incompetent to contest that that's not a legal argument. That's a man who's lost control of a situation and is doing whatever comes to hand. Silas rode back to the ranch harder than usual. He found Adelaide in the barn, which he hadn't expected, resetting the loose board on the south stall that had been making the horses nervous. She was balanced on a crate with a hammer in one hand and 3 nails held between her lips, and she turned when she heard him ride in and immediately understood from his face that something had happened. She took the nails out of her mouth and climbed down. He told her everything. All of it, without softening it, because Garrett was right and because Adelaide had made it plain from the beginning that she needed the full weight of things, not the managed version. She stood in the barn, listening with her hammer still in her hand and her face doing that controlled, processing thing it did when information was landing hard and she was cataloging it carefully rather than reacting to it. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Incompetent, she said. The word in her mouth had the texture of something she was holding at arm's length to look at clearly. My father is arguing I'm incompetent. He's threatening the argument. Garrett thinks he doesn't actually want the hearing. He doesn't want me to testify. Her voice had gone to a place that was beyond anger, past the hot part of it, and into something cooler and more considered. Because if I testify, I describe the signed document. His signature on my name, which is the thing he's most exposed on. She looked at Silas. He's trying to frighten me out of the room before I can speak in it. That's Garrett's read. Garrett's right. She set the hammer down on the stall rail with a careful, deliberate motion. I'm not leaving the room. Silas looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression of a woman who had been running for 8 months and had just, in this moment, in this barn in Blackthorn Ridge, finished running. I want to write to him, she said. My father, not through lawyers. Directly. Her jaw was set in a way he'd seen on her only once or twice before, not stubbornness exactly, but the particular resolution of someone who had located the line they were willing to defend. I want him to know I'm not afraid of the hearing. I want him to know I will stand in front of that judge and I will describe everything, beginning with the moment he signed my name to a contract I never agreed to. She paused. And I want him to understand that the only way this ends without a courtroom is if he ends it himself. The barn was quiet around them. One of the horses shifted in its stall, and dust moved in the light coming through the high window. And Silas stood looking at this woman who had arrived 11 weeks ago with a bag packed for escape and was now planting herself in this yard like something that had taken root. "All right," he said. "You think it'll work. I think your father is a man who calculates costs and benefits." He held her eyes. "You make the cost of continuing higher than the cost of stopping." That's the argument he understands. You're describing his own method. I know. It's a good method. Something shifted in her face, that expression again, the one she tried to keep contained, the one that was somewhere adjacent to warmth and had been appearing with increasing frequency. "I need paper," she said. "Kitchen desk, second drawer." "That's where you keep the invoices. There's room for both." She picked up her hammer and climbed back on the crate to finish the stall board, because Adelaide did not leave things half-fixed. He watched her for a moment. The particular economy of her movement, the way she hit the nail exactly right the first time, the way she didn't look down to check whether he was still there. Then he went to take care of the horses, because the horses still needed taking care of, and the world had not stopped turning, just because something significant had happened in it. That night she sat at the kitchen table and wrote to her father. He didn't read it, she didn't offer, and he didn't ask. But he sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and they occupied the same room while she wrote. And when she finished, she folded the letter and set it down and looked at it for a moment. "It's done," she said. "All right." She picked up the letter and held it in both hands. "If this doesn't work, it'll work or it won't, and we'll deal with what comes next." He picked up his cold coffee and stood up. "Either way, you're not doing it alone." She looked at him across the kitchen in the low lamplight. With the letter in her hands and the locked room now unlocked down the hall, and the drainage project nearly finished and the cistern started, and $300 of recovered accounts on the desk beside her. And she looked at him with all of that around her and said nothing. But she set the letter down like it was something she had decided to trust. The letter went out on the Friday supply rider, tucked inside an envelope addressed in Adelaide's precise handwriting to a legal firm in the eastern city where her father conducted the majority of his business, not to Adelaide Veynor directly. Because Adelaide had thought about that and decided a letter addressed to his lawyers carried more weight than one addressed to him personally. A personal letter could be ignored. A letter entering the legal record through his own representatives was harder to pretend hadn't arrived. Silas watched the supply rider take it without comment. Adelaide watched the supply rider take it and then went back inside and did not mention it again, which was how he knew she was working hard not to think about it. The waiting had a particular quality to it, not the waiting she'd done in the past 8 months that had been the waiting of someone listening for footsteps, always braced, always calculating the next move. This was different. This was the waiting of someone who had made a decision and sent it into the world and had to live in the space between the sending and the answer with no guarantee of what came back. She handled it by working, which was not surprising. What was slightly surprising was the nature of the work she threw herself into during those 2 weeks, not the accounts, not the infrastructure projects, but the ordinary domestic labor of the ranch that she'd been doing competently all along, but had never quite treated as hers. She replanted the kitchen garden that had gone mostly to weeds since Lenora died, choosing the layout herself based on what the soil and the sun access actually supported rather than what had been planted there before. She repainted the interior of the root cellar, which badly needed it. She fixed the latch on every interior door in the house that had been sticking or catching or failing in any way, working through them systematically over 3 days until every door in the house operated exactly as a door should. Silas noticed all of this. He didn't comment on any of it directly, because he understood what it was. It was Adelaide putting her hands on things and making them hers, in a way that was part declaration and part reassurance to herself. And commenting on it directly would have made her self-conscious about a process that was better left to run on its own. He did, on the 4th evening, come in from the barn to find her standing back and looking at the freshly painted root cellar door with a slightly critical expression. "The color is wrong," she said without turning around. "It looks better than it did. That's a low bar. The previous color was actively offensive." She tilted her head. "I'm going to repaint it next week. Something that works with the wood grain rather than against it. You're going to spend your time repainting a root cellar. I'm going to spend 2 hours correcting a decision I made in poor lighting." She finally turned, and her expression when she looked at him was somewhere between irritated at herself and settled in a way that had nothing to do with root cellars. "The garden is good, at least. The garden is excellent," he meant it. The kitchen garden had been a mess for 3 years, and what she'd done with it in a week was the kind of transformation that required both knowledge and genuine investment. "Where'd you learn to lay out a kitchen garden like that?" "Our housekeeper when I was 12. She moved toward the house. Mrs. Oben. She was the only person in that household who talked to me like I had a working brain. She said it plainly, the way she said most things about her past, not with bitterness, just information. She taught me accounting too, technically. She kept the household books and let me sit with her while she worked." She paused on the step. "My father thought it was an appropriate domestic skill for a girl to learn. He didn't realize she was teaching me to actually read financial documents rather than just record numbers. She sounds like a smart woman. She was the smartest person I knew until I was about 20. Adelaide pushed open the kitchen door. Then I started figuring some of it out on my own and realized she'd given me the tools for that too." Silas followed her inside and thought about a 12-year-old girl sitting beside a housekeeper learning to read numbers in a household where nobody thought she was worth the full conversation. And he thought about the fact that this woman had built herself from those materials, from a housekeeper's kitchen ledger, and a father who underestimated her, and 8 months of running, and the stubborn refusal to be reduced to the thing someone else had decided she was, and he felt something move in his chest that he'd been trying to identify for weeks and was getting closer to. He didn't name it that night, but he stopped pretending it wasn't there. The answer to Adelaide's letter arrived not in the form she expected. It didn't come through lawyers or writers or men in expensive coats. It came on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks after she'd sent the letter, in a plain envelope delivered by the regular post, addressed in handwriting she recognized as her father's personal secretary's, which meant Adelaide Veynor had dictated it, but not signed it himself, which meant something. Her father signed everything himself. His signature on correspondence was a point of personal principle, a demonstration that his attention had been on the matter. Using his secretary as the instrument meant distance. Means the situation had shifted enough that he was creating space between himself and the record. She stood at the kitchen table and opened it while Silas was still out with Dub on the north fence because she didn't want to open it in front of him and have her face do whatever it was going to do in front of someone else. She read it twice. Then she sat down and read it a third time, more slowly, making sure she understood what it actually said rather than what she feared it said or hoped it said. It was 2 paragraphs. The first acknowledged receipt of her previous communication. The second stated that, given the complexity of the current legal landscape and certain changes in the business arrangement with Conrad Bellamy, her father had determined that further pursuit of the matter at this time was not in the interest of the family. Not in the interest of the family. Not I release you. Not I was wrong. Not any admission of the thing he'd done with her name on that document. Just withdrawal, dressed in the language of strategic reconsideration, presented as a business decision, because everything Adelaide Veynor did was a business decision, and naming it otherwise would have required him to be a different kind of man. She sat with it for a long time. When Silas came in an hour later, she was still at the table, but she'd put the letter down and was looking out the window at the kitchen garden she'd planted, at the straight rows of it, at the work she'd done with her own hands and her own ground. He saw her face and read it correctly, which was something he'd gotten better at. "Tell me," he said. She passed him the letter. He read it standing, which was how Silas read things he rarely sat down for paper unless it required extended study. He read it once, turned it over to check the back, as though there might be something else written there, and then set it down. "He's out," Silas said. "He's withdrawing." "It's not the same thing." She looked at the letter. "He hasn't admitted anything. He hasn't apologized. He's just decided the cost-benefit calculation came out the wrong way, and he's stepping back until he finds a better angle." "You think he'll find one?" "I think he always believes he will." She paused. Competency hearing was his strongest move, and he backed away from it. "Which means Garrett Peel's message got through. Which means the prospect of me standing in front of a judge and describing the signed document was a cost he wasn't willing to pay." Silas sat down across from her. "What does this mean for the legal filing?" "The filing will be withdrawn. Probably within the week. The lawyers won't let it sit in the record longer than necessary once he's made the decision." She picked up the letter again, looked at it, set it back down. "It's over for now, in the sense that the immediate threat is gone." She was quiet for a moment. "He didn't do it because he accepted my choice. He did it because I made it too expensive not to." "Does it matter why?" She thought about that seriously, giving it the weight it deserved rather than a reflexive answer. "It matters for what I understand about him going forward," she said finally. "It doesn't change the outcome." She looked at Silas. I was staying before this letter arrived." "The letter just removes a complication. The letter removes a significant complication." "Yes." She almost smiled. "It does." He looked at her across the table and said what he'd been thinking about for 2 weeks, or maybe longer. Maybe since a Wednesday afternoon when he'd watched her lay out a kitchen garden with the focused satisfaction of someone making something that was going to last. "I want to have the minister out," he said. Not for he paused, reorganizing. "We've been telling people we're married. We did the county registration. But I want to do it properly, if you want that." Adelaide was quiet. "I'm not doing this because your father backed down," he said. "I'm not doing it to shore up the legal position, though that's not a nothing consideration. I'm asking because..." He stopped, and the stopping was not avoidance, but the genuine difficulty of a man trying to say something exactly right that he didn't have extensive practice saying. "Because I want to. Because you fixed every door in this house and replanted a garden and told me to open a room I'd been keeping locked for 4 years. And you were right about the cistern overflow, and you were right about the drainage, and you're probably right. The root cellar color and I..." He stopped again. "Silas, I want you to choose this the way I'm choosing it. Not as an arrangement, as the thing itself." The kitchen was very quiet. Adelaide looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before, something fully open, without the layer of watchfulness that was usually present, something that had let go of the calculating quality and was just looking. Just her directly, with nothing managed between. "The minister is Reverend Callum," she said. "He talks for 40 minutes minimum on any occasion." "He does. That's going to be a significant amount of Reverend Callum." "It is." She looked at him for another moment. "Saturday," she said. "If Ellie can come. I'll ask Dub tonight, and we need to finish the east drainage by Friday, or it'll bother me all through the ceremony." "Adelaide, I'm serious. I will be thinking about the drainage." "We'll finish the drainage," he said, "by Thursday." The east drainage got finished by Thursday because Adelaide was precise about timelines, and Silas had learned that when Adelaide set a timeline, it was accurate rather than optimistic. And because Dub worked a long day Wednesday without being specifically asked, having a sense of events and wanting to be useful about it in a practical way. Saturday came with the kind of October morning that Blackthorn Ridge occasionally produced, cold and clear, with a quality of light that made everything look more itself. Ellie came early, which Silas had expected, and she brought her eldest daughter and the jar of late tomatoes she'd promised, and a dress that she'd told Adelaide was her second best because her best was put up for her own funeral, which was Ellie's way of indicating affection. Dub came clean and uncomfortable in his formal clothes and stood in the kitchen doorway, radiating the particular energy of a man who was genuinely moved and had very few means of expressing it. Reverend Callum talked for 43 minutes. Silas knew because he was watching the clock above the mantel from the position of someone enduring rather than participating, while Adelaide stood beside him with the perfect composure of a woman who had survived worse than a lengthy sermon, Sue, and was prepared to survive this too. The ceremony itself took about 8 minutes once Callum reached the actual point of it. Adelaide said yes like she meant it. Silas said yes like he meant it. There was no performance in either answer. They'd both long since used up whatever they might have used for performance. Afterward, Ellie cried without acknowledging that she was crying, which Silas recognized as one of her more consistent qualities, and Dub shook Silas's hand with both of his and didn't say a word, which meant more than any sentence would have. Reverend Callum had coffee and the good cornbread Adelaide had made that morning, and spoke at some length about the importance of community. And Adelaide listened, with the polite attention of a woman who was also reviewing drainage calculations in the back of her mind. Later, after Callum and the others had gone, they were alone in the house in the particular quiet of an afternoon that has had significance in it. Silas was washing up at the sink, and Adelaide was putting away the plates. And they moved around each other in the kitchen, in the way they'd learned to move around each other over these weeks, the specific negotiated geography of two people who have worked out where the other one is going to be. Satisfied, he said. She considered the question seriously, which was one of the things about her. She always considered questions seriously, even the ones that seemed to want quick answers. With the drainage, she said yes. With the ceremony, she paused. Callum's address was excessive, but the part that mattered was sufficient. High praise. Don't push it. She set the last plate on the shelf and turned around and looked at him directly, in the way she'd been doing more of since the day she stood in the center of the kitchen and stopped keeping one foot pointed at the door. Silas, thank you. He turned from the sink. For what specifically? For asking me to choose it, rather than just remaining in an arrangement that had become something else without being named. She held his gaze. It mattered that you asked. He looked at her for a moment. It mattered that you said yes, he said. She nodded once and picked up the dish towel, and they finished the kitchen without ceremony, which was exactly right for both of them. November came and brought the particular character of a Blackthorn Ridge winter beginning not the worst weather yet, but the first serious cold, the kind that found the gaps in structures and required attention. The north corner of the barn turned out to have a gap between the roof boards that Adelaide identified by the quality of how the horses were standing clustered wrong, she said, which meant there was a draft they didn't like, and this led to a 2-day repair project that required Silas on the roof and Adelaide handing up materials below, and a disagreement about the overlap angle of the new boards that was resolved only. When Adelaide climbed up and demonstrated her point directly, which led to a 20-minute standoff during which both of them sat on the barn roof in the cold, making competing arguments with their hands. The overlap goes this way, she said. I've been roofing this barn for 15 years. And for 15 years, the north corner has been throwing water into the joint instead of away from it. I can see the staining from here. He looked at where she was pointing. He did not say anything. He redid the overlap her way. She did not say anything about that either, which was one of her better qualities. Dub, who had been watching from the ground with his arms crossed, said to Ellie later that evening that he'd never in his life seen Silas Mercer sit on a roof in the cold and let someone change his mind. And Ellie said she'd never seen Adelaide Mercer climb a barn roof to prove a point and not wait for credit, and Dub said that sounded about right for both of them, and Ellie agreed that it did. The sheriff's outcome on Barton's boy came through in November. The evidence Adelaide had documented was solid enough that the case was straightforward, and Barton's boy made a repayment agreement rather than face the full charge, which meant the money came back over time rather than immediately, but it came back. Garrett Peel sent word through the supply rider, and Adelaide received the note, read it, and put it in the accounts file under resolved, which was the extent of her acknowledgement. Silas told her she could be more satisfied about it. I am satisfied, she said. I just don't celebrate bookkeeping. You recovered $40 and established a documentation method that will prevent it from happening again. That's not bookkeeping. That's, he looked for the word. Good practice, she offered. I was going to say impressive. She looked at him with the expression she got when something landed unexpectedly. You were not. I was. I've gotten better at saying things. She held his gaze for a moment. You have, she said. Marginally. High praise, you keep using that phrase. It keeps being applicable. She turned back to the accounts and he could see the side of her face from where he stood, and the thing adjacent to a smile was there, the one he'd catalogued. And he stopped looking because he'd learned that watching it too directly made it disappear. December came in hard. The first serious snow hit on a Thursday and kept going through Sunday, which was 3 days of the ranch closing in on itself in the way it did in heavy weather. The cattle managed into the covered paddock. The water situation monitored twice daily, the stove going continuously, and the house acquiring the specific warm closeness of a building, working to maintain itself against cold outside. They were inside together for 3 days, without significant break, which was a different condition from anything they'd had before. Not unpleasant, but revealing in the way that close quarters always were the things you could edit out of a day. You had the option of being elsewhere became unavoidable when you were both simply in the house, moving through the same rooms, adjusting around each other without the buffer of work that took you to opposite ends of the property. Silas discovered that Adelaide, when genuinely at rest rather than engaged in productive work, did not know what to do with herself. She picked up books and set them down. She reorganized sections of the kitchen that were already organized. She stood at the window and looked at the snow with the expression of someone who was trying to calculate its impact on the drainage project and finding the calculation unsatisfying because there was nothing to act on yet. On the second day, he said, "What did you do at home?" When the weather kept you in, she thought about it. My father had a library, 1,200 volumes. Did you read all of them? Most of them. She looked at him. Do you have books? Some. In the main room, the shelves behind the chair. He hadn't touched most of them in years. Take whatever you want. She went and looked at the shelves with the same assessment she gave everything systematic, thorough, coming to conclusions. She came back with 3 books, and that was her portion of the next day and a half. She read the way she did everything, with complete focus, and occasionally she would say something into the room directed at him, without entirely looking up from the page a fact she'd encountered, a question. Once an objection to something the author had asserted about soil composition that was, Silas thought, probably correct. He repaired harness leather and listened to her object to the soil composition book and thought that this was the most fully he'd occupied a winter in 4 years. On the 3rd day, late afternoon, when the snow had finally stopped and they were waiting for enough light to assess the situation outside, she looked up from the book she was reading and said, "Silas." He looked up from the harness. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to not respond until I've finished saying it." He set the harness down. She looked at him with that direct, fully open expression she had when she was communicating something that mattered and wanted to do it accurately. "I have not been someone who trusted easily," she said. "That's not a complaint, and it's not a bid for sympathy. Fact about how I've lived." She held his gaze. "The past year before I came here, during the months I was moving, I stopped expecting that anybody would do the right thing for a reason that wasn't transactional. I stopped believing that was available to me." She paused. "And then you lied to Roderick Vale without being asked, without negotiating terms. You just did it because it was the right thing and it was in front of you." He waited. She'd said not to respond yet. "And then you said our side in the sheriff's office," she said. "And you asked me to choose properly rather than just staying in an arrangement. And you went into that room." She stopped, recalibrated. "I am not. I don't say things like this easily. I want you to know that it means something that I'm saying it." She looked at him steadily. "You are the most unexpectedly decent person I have ever met, Silas Mercer. And I say that with full awareness that you leave coffee cups in inexplicable locations, and you have strong wrong opinions about roof overlap angles, and you went 2 years overpaying the feed store without noticing. He was quiet for a moment. You said not to respond until you finished, he said. I'm finished. He looked at her for a moment and then said, You're the most capable and difficult and unexpectedly important person who has ever reorganized my kitchen. She pressed her lips together very hard. That's all you've got, she said. I also think you were right about the garden layout. You're terrible at this, I know. He held her gaze. But I mean every word of it, in case that wasn't clear. She looked at him for a long time, this woman who had built herself from a housekeeper's ledger and her own stubborn refusal to be diminished, who had arrived with a bag packed for escape and had slowly, room by room and door by door, decided to stay, who had been precise and difficult and entirely worth every complication she'd come with. I know, she said quietly. The snow outside had gone from falling to settled, and through the window the late afternoon light was hitting it in a way that made the north field look almost luminous. And the house was warm, and the stove was steady, and the lamp between them made a small circle of light in the room. They sat with that for a while, not doing anything with it, just letting it be what it was. The following week brought the practical return to full ranch operations, and with it a letter that Silas had been half expecting, but Adelaide hadn't, not from her father, not from lawyers, but from the county land office, informing them that the water rights documentation for the Eastern Creek section needed to be updated to reflect the new ownership structure following the marriage registration. It was a bureaucratic letter, the kind that required a response but not an urgent one, and Silas brought it in and set it on the table and explained what it was. Adelaide read it and then looked up with an expression he couldn't quite read. It lists me as a co-holder, she said. That's the updated structure. I didn't. She stopped. You didn't tell me you were doing that. The marriage registration updates the property rights. It's automatic. It's not automatic everywhere. In some counties, the wife's rights are. She stopped again, and something moved through her face that she didn't try to hide, which was unusual. You could have arranged it differently. I could have, he agreed. I didn't want to. She looked at the letter for a long moment. He understood, watching her face, what this was. It wasn't about the water rights specifically. It was about what the water rights represented, the difference between living somewhere under someone's protection and actually belonging to a place, having a stake in it that the law recognized, that a document confirmed. After 8 months of being legally attached to nothing, of existing in the gap between who her father said she was and who she was making herself, a letter from the county land office that put her name beside his on a water rights document was not a small thing. Adelaide, he said. I'm fine, she said. She set the letter down and picked up her pen and was not fine in the temporary way people were not fine when something has gotten past their defenses in a way they weren't prepared for. He didn't comment on that. He got up and put water on for coffee and gave her the time to process it without an audience, which was what she needed. And he counted the days since she'd arrived and thought about how different the kitchen felt from what it had been in October when she sat across from him, and said both when he asked if Blackthorn Ridge was what she wanted, and what the distance between that moment and this one looked like from the outside. He thought it looked like a home being built, not the house, which had always been there. Something else, something that required two people who had both been living at an arm's length from their own lives, and a specific set of circumstances, and a long series of small decisions that added up to something larger than any single choice. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table. She had her composure back by the time he set the cup in front of her, which took approximately the amount of time it took to boil water, which told him something about how much practice she'd had at recovering herself. She picked up the cup and held it and looked at him. Thank you, she said. Not for the coffee. It's your land too, he said. That's all. She nodded and opened the account book and went back to work. And he sat across from her with his coffee and the harness he was still repairing. and the kitchen held them both in the ordinary businesses of the afternoon. And the letter from the county land office sat on the corner of the table with both their names on it. January brought a cattle problem. Not catastrophic. Silas had managed enough January cattle problems to know the difference between serious and catastrophic, and this was serious, which meant it required immediate attention and would cost money and labor, but would not break anything permanent. 3 animals in the west paddock showed the early signs of lung sickness, and the question was containment and treatment, and the question had to be answered before the question became larger. What he hadn't expected was Adelaide's involvement. She had not, in the months she'd been at the ranch, involved herself in the livestock management. It wasn't avoidance. She understood the ranch well enough to have opinions, but she'd made a practical assessment early on that Silas knew cattle and she didn't, and she'd focused her energy on the areas where her knowledge was superior and let him have his. It was one of the cleaner divisions of competence he'd encountered. But when the cattle problem emerged, she was the one who found the reference in an agricultural almanac she'd apparently been reading, which was news to him, and she came to him in the barn on a Tuesday morning and said, "The treatment protocol in here is more aggressive on the timeline than what you're planning." He looked at the almanac. He read the relevant section. "This is a Texas method," he said. "It's an effective method. The timeline matters. The infection spreads faster in cold weather, and if you wait the 3 days you're planning, you'll have 6 animals instead of 3. He looked at the 3 cattle in question. He looked at the almanac. He looked at Adelaide. "Who told you I was waiting 3 days?" "Dub," I asked him. "You asked Dub?" "I wanted to understand the timeline before I said anything to you." She was practical about it, not apologetic. "You know cattle. I'm not telling you how to manage them. I'm telling you what I read and leaving the decision with you." He took the almanac from her and read the section again. He moved up his timeline by 2 days. They lost none of the 3 animals. Dub, when the situation resolved, said to Silas very quietly, "She asked me about the cattle 4 days ago." "I know. She wasn't trying to go around you. She was trying to understand before she spoke." "I know that too," Dub nodded. "She's good for this place." Silas looked across the paddock to where Adelaide was inspecting the drainage outlet she'd had them install in October, checking the winter performance of it in the way she checked everything she'd built, not because she doubted it, but because she believed that things you built needed to be observed over time to understand if you'd built them right. "I know," he said. February arrived, and with February the anniversary that Silas had never known how to occupy. 4 years since Lenora. He hadn't told Adelaide the specific date. There hadn't been an occasion that called for it, but she knew the rough timing from things he'd said, from Ellie, who didn't believe in keeping information to herself when she thought it mattered. On that specific morning, Silas woke before first light and lay in the dark and did what he'd done every February for 4 years, which was think about 11 days and the specific weight of waiting that had defined them. He thought about Lenora's voice first, then her face, then the particular way she'd said his name in the mornings unhurried, like she had all day for it. He lay with the memory the way you held something fragile, carefully enough not to break it. Then he got up, because he was not a man who lay in the dark longer than necessary, and he went to the kitchen. Adelaide was not there, which was unusual. She was reliably an early riser. The kitchen was cold, the stove not yet started. He started it himself and put water on and stood at the window looking at the February dark outside. He heard her in the hallway, a few minutes later, not in the kitchen but moving toward the back of the house, and then the quiet sound of the door at the end of the hall being opened the full way, not the inch or two it usually rested at, but opened and staying open. He didn't move from the window. He heard nothing from the room for a long moment. Then she came back to the kitchen, and she was carrying the small oil lamp that lived on the table in that room, Lenora's lamp, the one he'd lit the first time he went back in, and she set it on the kitchen table and lit it without explanation, and started making coffee like it was an ordinary morning. He turned from the window and looked at her. She looked at him once, briefly, with an expression that asked nothing and offered nothing except presence just. I know what day this is, and I'm here, and that's all this needs to be. He sat down at the table. They had coffee in the light of Lenora's lamp while the February dark outside lightened slowly toward morning, and neither of them said anything, and that was exactly right. Later, mid-morning, when the ranch was moving again, and Dub was in the barn, and the day had become ordinary, Adelaide was at the table with the accounts when she said without looking up, "The lamp belongs on the kitchen table. If that's all right with you." He was at the stove with his back to her. "It's all right with me," he said. She made a small sound of acknowledgement and turned a page, and the lamp stayed where she'd put it, and the kitchen held them both in the ordinary business of a February morning. And the room at the back of the house stayed open with its door resting easy, full of air and weak winter light and everything that had been preserved in it, no longer locked, no longer separate from the life going on in the rest of the house. Silas stood at the stove and thought that he had not expected any of this, not the particular form of it, not what it had turned out to cost, or what it had turned out to give, and he thought that Adelaide had been right about the drainage, and right about the roof angle, and right about the cistern, and right about the door, and he thought that there was something clarifying about a person who was simply right about things, not because it made anything easy, but because it made the things that mattered easier to see. He turned around. She was bent over the accounts with her pen moving, her dark hair falling forward slightly, the small lamp beside her making a circle of warmth in the cold winter morning. He thought about the 11 lines he'd written and what he'd thought he was asking for, and he thought about what he'd gotten instead. And he thought that the distance between those two things was the distance between a man managing his life and a man actually living it. He picked up his cup and his hat and went out to check the east drainage in the late winter light, because the drainage was his now too, in the way that things became yours when you'd been part of building them. And behind him in the kitchen, Adelaide turned a page, and the lamp burned steady on the table, and the door at the end of the hall stood open to the February morning coming through. The east drainage held through February without a single problem. Adelaide checked it every few days, not because she doubted the construction, but because she'd built the habit of watching things she'd made. She wanted to know how they performed under real conditions, where the small miscalculations showed up, what she'd do differently next time. The outlet ran clean through 2 significant thaws and 1 ice event that had Silas concerned about the north field, and both times the water moved exactly where she'd calculated it would move, out through the channel and away from the root systems and the foundation of the barn, and the north field didn't flood. Silas told her the drainage had worked. She said she knew. He said she could be more openly satisfied about it. She said she'd be openly satisfied about it in April when the spring melt came through and they knew for certain whether the design held under full load. He said that was a reasonable position. She said thank you. She thought so too. It was the kind of conversation they had more of, now that particular register of 2 people who had found the frequency where they understood each other without requiring explanation, where the shorthand had developed naturally over months of proximity and disagreement and the specific work of learning another person's mind. Not effortless because nothing real was effortless, but fluent in a way that had taken time and wasn't taken for granted. March came in the way. March came to Blackthorn Ridge, which was to say unreliably and with strong opinions. 3 days of warmth that suggested spring was arriving, then a hard frost that killed the suggestion, then a week of mud, so thorough it made every task on the ranch twice as difficult and half as satisfying. Silas managed it the way he managed every March, which was by accepting that the month was going to be combative and not taking it personally. Adelaide managed it by identifying the 3 worst mud problems on the property and designing drainage solutions for all 3, 2 of which they could implement that season and 1 of which would have to wait for drier ground. She also developed a strong opinion about the state of the paddock fencing, which she communicated to Silas on a Tuesday morning while both of them were standing in the mud looking at the section in question. The lower rail is rotting, she said. I've been aware of the lower rail. For how long? Couple of years. She looked at him. Before you arrived, he said. It needs to be replaced before spring puts weight on the fence line. Cattle push harder in spring. I know how cattle behave in spring. Then you know the fence needs replacing. I have known the fence needs replacing. There are a lot of things on this ranch that need doing, and a limited number of hours in a day. She looked at the fence, then at him with the expression she got when she was assembling a counter-argument. If we do the west section first and work east, we can complete it in 4 days. Dub and one hired man. That's 4 days of labor cost. It's 4 days of labor cost now, or a broken fence line and loose cattle in April, which is 10 days of labor cost and lost weight on the animals. She looked at him evenly. The arithmetic is not complicated. He stood in the mud and accepted, privately, that she was right, and said, I'll talk to Dub. I already talked to Dub. He agrees with me. Of course he does. He said, and I'm quoting, Adelaide's right about the fence. She's been right about everything. Just do what she says. Those were his exact words. Dub is a traitor. Dub is practical. She turned back toward the house. 4 days. Start Thursday. They started Thursday. It was during the fence work, on the second day, that something happened that nobody had prepared for and that changed the shape of everything that came after. Started with Adelaide not being at breakfast. This was unusual enough that Silas noticed it immediately because Adelaide was a consistent morning person, and her absence from the kitchen at the expected hour had a specific quality that was different from simply sleeping later. He waited 20 minutes and then went to check and found her sitting on the edge of the bed they now shared in the manner of someone who has been sitting very still for some time and is conducting a private assessment of their own condition. She looked up when he came in. I think, she said, carefully, that something may have changed. He looked at her face, which was the color of someone who had been unwell recently and was deciding how to characterize the experience. Changed how? I've been sick the past few mornings. Before you wake up, she stopped. The way she stopped was the way she stopped when she was being precise. I've been counting days. Silas stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at his wife sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap and her gray eyes absolutely steady. Delivering this information with the same careful accuracy she brought to everything she said, and it took him about 4 seconds to understand what she was telling him. How certain are you? He said. Not completely. Not without more time, she held his gaze. But the pattern is consistent, and I'm not someone who miscounts. He sat down on the bed beside her, not close enough to crowd her, just near present in the same place. They sat with it for a moment, this information that was too large to process quickly and too significant to set aside. How are you feeling? He said, unwell in the mornings. Fine the rest of the time so far, she paused, not frightened. In case that's what you were about to ask, I wasn't going to ask that. You were thinking it. I was thinking you'd tell me if you were. She looked at him for a moment. I'm not frightened, she said again. I am. She stopped and did the thing she did when she was reaching for a precise word. Surprised at myself. I expected to be frightened, and I'm not. That surprises me more than the information does. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that Adelaide Veynor, who had arrived in Blackthorn Ridge with a bag packed for escape, and her back always toward the wall, was sitting beside him on a February morning telling him she wasn't frightened, and that the surprise in her voice was genuine, and that the genuine surprise was evidence of something. You've stopped expecting things to go wrong, he said. Quiet for a moment. Maybe, she said, I'm not sure I'd go that far. Not that things can't go wrong, just that they don't have to. She looked at him, and the expression on her face was the one he'd been cataloging since September, that open thing, without the watchfulness, that had been appearing more frequently and staying longer. That might be it, she said quietly. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the bed, and she didn't move her hand away. and they sat there in the morning quiet of the bedroom for another few minutes before the practical necessities of the day began asserting themselves. "Fence," she said eventually. "The fence can wait an hour." "It cannot wait an hour. Dub is already out there. Dub has been building fences since before we were born. He can manage an hour." She looked at him with the expression of a woman determining whether an argument was worth having. She apparently determined it wasn't. "An hour," she said. They sat for the hour, not doing anything with it except occupying it together, which was exactly what the hour required. The fence got finished on schedule. Adelaide's paddock redesign held through the first hard spring rain in March, and the water moved as she'd calculated, and the paddock remained functional while 2 other ranches in the valley had flooding problems that cost them stock and time. Word of this spread in the way things spread in Blackthorn Ridge, which was through Ellie primarily, and the version that circulated through town was accurate enough. The Mercer Ranch hadn't flooded because of drainage work the new wife had designed. The new wife part of this was shifting in how the community used it. It had started, when Adelaide arrived, as a designation that carried a question mark: the new wife, the strange woman from somewhere east, the one nobody knew anything about. It had become, over months, something else: the woman who fixed the accounts and found the fraud in the feed store invoices. The woman who knew cattle illness from an almanac and moved up the treatment timeline and saved 3 animals. The woman on the barn roof arguing about overlap angles. The woman who had the Mercer drainage working correctly for the first time in 15 years. Still the new wife, technically, but the qualifier had changed its character. Ellie told Adelaide this directly on a Thursday afternoon in March when she came by, ostensibly about the tomato seedlings she was starting early. Actually about the fact that she'd heard the news Adelaide hadn't told her yet and was not prepared to pretend otherwise. "People are talking about you," Ellie said. "People have been talking about me since I arrived," Adelaide said. Different talking. Before it was speculation. Suspicion. Who is this woman? What's she hiding? What does Silas think he's doing? Ellie put her seedlings on the kitchen table with the confidence of someone who knew she was welcome. "Now it's more like, have you talked to Adelaide Mercer about your drainage? She redesigned the east channel at their place, and it's the best water management in the valley." Adelaide looked at the seedlings. "That's a significant shift." "You earned it. I did the work. That's not the same as earning it. Plenty of people do work that doesn't get acknowledged." Ellie looked at her with the direct gaze of a woman who understood that statement was carrying more than its face value. "True, but you did the work somewhere people could see it, and you stuck around long enough for the scene to happen." She paused. "There's a woman on the South Road, the Hartley place. She came by last week asking about you. Wants advice on her kitchen garden. She can come by any morning." "I'll tell her." Ellie settled into the chair like someone planning to stay a while, which she was. "How are you feeling?" Adelaide met her eyes. "Ellie." "I heard. I'm not going to say from who because I have some discretion." "You heard from Dub, who heard from Silas." "I heard from Dub, who heard from Silas, who did not technically tell Dub anything, but stood in the barn looking the way. Silas Mercer looked the afternoon Lenora told him, and Dub has been working for Silas since before I married Dub, so he knows the look." Ellie folded her hands on the table. "How are you feeling?" Adelaide was quiet for a moment. She looked at the seedlings, the small green starts of them, early and optimistic, and not yet concerned about what the weather might do. "Different than I expected to feel," she said. "Good, different, or—" "Good." She said it with the directness she brought to true things. "I am good, Ellie. That is the whole answer." Ellie looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a woman who had been watching Adelaide Mercer since September and had opinions about the trajectory she'd observed. "You look it," she said. "You didn't look it when you arrived." "No," Adelaide agreed. "I didn't. You looked like a woman running so hard she'd forgotten what she was running toward." Adelaide considered this. "I wasn't running toward anything. I was running away from something. There's a difference." "And now?" She looked at the kitchen at the lamp on the table that she'd moved from Lenora's room, At the accounts stacked neatly on the shelf she'd claimed. At the garden she could see through the window, starting to show the first green suggestions of what was coming. At the door to the back hallway that was simply a door now, no longer the entrance to something sealed. "Now I'm somewhere," she said. Ellie nodded once, satisfied, and turned her attention to the seedling arrangement on the table, and they talked about tomatoes for the next hour, which was a conversation Adelaide found she was genuinely interested in, because everything that grew in this ground was hers to think about now. April arrived, and the spring melt came through, and the east drainage held under full load, exactly as Adelaide had designed it. She went out on the morning after the heaviest runoff and walked the whole channel herself, checking every joint and outlet and catch basin. And Silas went with her, not because he needed to, but because it was a long walk and early, and he'd learned that early morning was when Adelaide was most likely to say things she hadn't planned to say. The drainage had performed. She knew it before she checked, in the way you knew things you'd designed carefully and built correctly, but she checked anyway because that was who she was. "Satisfied?" he said, when she'd crouched at the last outlet and watched the water running clean through it. She stood up and looked at the channel, the whole length of it, running through the property they both owned, doing the work she'd calculated it would do. "Yes," she said. "Not qualified this time. Not mostly or for now or pending further observation. Just yes." He stood beside her and looked at what she'd built. "You're going to redesign the whole water system eventually," he said. "I'm already designing it. I have notes. Of course you do. The West Cistern overflow is still wrong. We've been married 6 months, and you are still talking about the West Cistern overflow. The West Cistern overflow doesn't stop being wrong because we got married. I fixed the West Cistern overflow in January. You adjusted it. That's different from correcting the fundamental design problem, which is that the lip height is calculated for average rainfall rather than peak rainfall, which means in a heavy year. Adelaide, yes, I know about the cistern. I have always known about the cistern. I will fix the cistern when the ground is right for it." She looked at him. "When will the ground be right for it?" "June. I'm marking June on the calendar. I assumed you already had." She hadn't, quite, but she did that afternoon, and he saw it when he came into the kitchen and smiled to himself in the direction of the stove so she wouldn't catch him doing it. The letter from Adelaide Veynor came in late April. Not through lawyers this time, not through a secretary or a representative or a man with expensive boots sent to find her. It was a letter in her father's own handwriting, which was the thing that told her before she read the first sentence that something had fundamentally shifted. Adelaide Veynor wrote things himself when he had decided they mattered enough to own. Directly, and this was apparently one of those things. She opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning while Silas was in the barn. She read it twice, which was her practice. Then she set it down and looked at the window for a while. When Silas came in, she was still at the table, but her posture was different from the other times. She'd sat at that table with correspondence from home. It didn't have the held quality, the braced quality, the physical readiness for bad news. She was just sitting, and when she heard him at the door, she turned and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. "Read it," she said. He picked up the letter. Her father wrote that the arrangement with Conrad Bellamy had concluded formally and finally in March. Bellamy had entered into a new partnership, and the financial alliance that had made Adelaide's marriage to him seem necessary had been restructured in other ways. He wrote that the legal proceedings against Adelaide were permanently withdrawn. Then he wrote something that was, Silas suspected, one of the harder sentences Adelaide Veynor had ever constructed. He wrote that he had received Adelaide's last letter, the one in which she had informed him she was expecting a child, and that this news had required him to consider his position carefully. He did not use words like "I was wrong," because Adelaide Veynor did not build himself the kind of man who used those words, but the sentence he used instead was precise and honest in its own way. I find that I would prefer to be part of your life in whatever capacity remains available to me rather than to continue as an opposition to it. Whatever capacity remains available to me. Silas read the sentence twice. He set the letter down and looked at Adelaide. He's asking to be let back in, she said. Her voice was neutral in the careful way it went neutral when she was processing something that had more than one layer. That's what he's saying. On terms I set. She looked at the letter. He doesn't say it that way. He would never say it that way. But that's what the sentence means. What are you going to do? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the stove popped once and settled, and the kitchen held its ordinary sounds. I don't know yet, she said. He's not a man who becomes a different man because the situation changes. He did what he did because he genuinely believed my objections were irrelevant, and that belief doesn't disappear because it became inconvenient. She paused. But he is my father. And this she gestured at the kitchen. The house, the land outside the window, this is real enough now that I can look at him from a position that isn't running from him. That's different, very different. She folded the letter. I'm going to write back, not immediately, when I've thought it through. She set the folded letter to the side. I'm not inviting him here, not yet, possibly not for a long time. But I'm also not finished with him, if that makes sense. It makes sense, she looked at him. Does it bother you? He considered the question with the care she always gave questions that deserved it. He did something I think was wrong, he said. He treated you like a transaction and then tried to have you declared incompetent when you objected to being one. That's not a small thing to overlook. He paused. But he's the only father you've got, and the child we're having is going to be his grandchild. And you're the one who gets to decide what you do with that, not me. He met her eyes. Whatever you decide, I'm not going to tell you you're wrong for it. She looked at him steadily, even if I decide to let him come here eventually. Even then, it'll be your call, and I'll manage my opinion about the man in the barn where it won't create problems. The thing at the corner of her mouth appeared. That's very considerate. I have my moments. She picked up her pen and opened the accounts, which meant the conversation was concluded to her satisfaction. And Silas poured himself coffee and sat at the table and thought about the letter and what it represented a powerful man who had done a contemptible thing and was now, in the only language available to him, asking whether the damage was permanent. The answer to that was Adelaide's to give, and she'd give it in her own time and her own terms, and it would be, whatever it was, exactly the right answer for her. He trusted that. He would not have trusted it of someone he'd known for 6 months in ordinary circumstances. But these had not been ordinary circumstances, and Adelaide was not someone whose judgment he'd found wanting in any of the situations where it had been tested, and he'd been married to her long enough now to understand the difference between trusting someone because you needed to and trusting someone because they'd earned it at every decision point that mattered. She'd earned it. He drank his coffee and left her to the accounts because the accounts were hers, and she did her best thinking when nobody was hovering at the edges of it. May came with warmth that was genuine this time rather than preliminary, and the ranch moved into the full business of spring in the way it moved into spring every year. More work, more daylight, more of everything that the cold months had compressed into patience, finally releasing itself into action. The cattle were healthier than the previous spring. Kitchen garden came up clean and straight in the rows Adelaide had laid out. The east drainage performed through every rain event in April and May, and the north field stayed dry, and the grass came in strong. And Silas stood at the fence one morning in early May and looked at the north field and thought about the season it would have been without the channel work, and what that had been worth. Dub came and stood beside him in the way Dub had of appearing at fences. Good grass this year, Dub said. Good drainage this year. Same thing in the end. Dub was quiet for a moment, looking at the field. She's good, Silas. I know. I mean the grass. Obviously the grass. Obviously. Dub worked the piece of grass between his teeth. Also your wife. I know that too. Just making sure you're saying it out loud occasionally. I say it. When, recently? Dub looked skeptical. Silas declined to elaborate, and they stood at the fence in the comfortable silence of two men who had been working the same ground long enough that silence required no management. Eventually, Dub said, "You seem different. People keep saying that." "Because it keeps being true." Dub looked at him sideways. "You seemed like a man who was managing his life. Now you seem like a man who's living it." Silas thought about that. He thought about the 11 lines he'd written to a marriage agency, what he'd thought he was asking for, what he'd thought he needed. He thought about a gray-eyed woman stepping off a stagecoach and looking at the water tower before she looked at him. "She changed things," he said. "She did." Dub pushed off the fence. "So did you, for what it's worth. Different people than when she arrived." Silas looked at the Northfield and thought that was true and was more complicated than he had language for this early in the morning. "Get back to work, Dub," he said. "Already going," Dub said and went. The weeks of May filled themselves with the ordinary weight of a working ranch in a good season, and within that weight the other thing was growing, not metaphorically, literally, in the specific and undeniable way that changed Adelaide's mornings, and some of her afternoons, and the way she moved through the kitchen, and occasionally the way she sat very still for a moment and put her hand against her side with an expression on. Her face that Silas hadn't seen before and was learning. She was not good at being managed or fussed over, which he had anticipated and prepared for. She continued to check the drainage and argue about the cistern and correct the accounts and give Dub's wife agricultural opinions that Ellie found equal parts impressive and exhausting. She did all of this more carefully than before, with a new quality of attention to her own limits that she wouldn't have acknowledged as caution because she didn't like the word applied to herself, but that was what it was. Silas did not fuss, he adapted, which was different. He checked the drainage with her in the mornings, because it gave him an excuse to walk the property at a pace that suited her without presenting it as accommodation. He started the stove earlier, so the kitchen was warm when she came in. He said nothing about the fact that she had, for the first time in months, moved her reading chair 3 feet closer to the stove, and nothing about the cup of ginger tea she'd started making herself in the mornings. These were small adjustments to a life made privately, and he honored the privacy of them. She noticed all of it. She didn't comment, but he could tell. She noticed by the way something in her posture had gradually, over the months, removed its last traces of wariness. One evening in late May, they sat on the porch after supper, a thing they'd started doing in the warm months, just the two of them, in the particular quiet of a ranch settling into evening. Adelaide had the almanac she'd been reading since the cattle illness incident, apparently for the second time. Silas had nothing in his hands, which was unusual, but the evening felt like a nothing-in-the-hands kind of evening. The light was doing that thing it did in late May in Blackthorn Ridge, going golden and long across the fields, and the East Channel caught some of it and ran with it briefly. And the Northfield was exactly the color that good, healthy spring grass was, which was the best color Silas knew. "I've been thinking about what Dub said," Adelaide said without looking up from the almanac. "Dub says a lot of things, that you seemed like a man managing his life before, and now you seem like a man living it." He was quiet for a moment. "He said that to you?" "He said it to Ellie, and Ellie said it to me." She turned a page. "She's not known for her discretion." "No. Is it true?" He looked at the Northfield, at the channel running along its edge, at the fence line that was fully repaired and solid, at the kitchen garden, visible through the window from where he sat, growing in the rows that Adelaide had laid out, that were going to produce better than any kitchen garden this property had seen in years. "Yes," he said. "It's true." She didn't respond immediately. She read another half-page of the almanac, which meant she was thinking about something and needed the page to think against. "I used to believe," she said, "that starting over meant leaving everything behind. That you couldn't carry anything from a previous life into a new one without it contaminating the new one." She paused. "I think I was wrong about that. What changed your mind?" "Your wife's lamp." she said, in the kitchen, and the room at the end of the hall. She set the almanac in her lap and looked at the evening. You carry her with you, not as a weight, just as part of who you became. And that doesn't make any less room for what's here. It just makes you more of what you are. She paused. I think that's true for me too, what I came from. The things that were difficult, they're part of what I know how to do. I can't put them down, and I don't think I should. Silas looked at her on the porch in the late evening light, this woman who had thought carefully about everything, and said what she thought with the directness of someone who had learned the cost of not saying it. And he thought about what Dub had said, and what she'd just said, and what the distance was between the man who had written 11 lines to a marriage agency and the man sitting on his porch in May with good grass in his north field, and a wife who read almanacs and argued about cistern angles and put a lamp on the kitchen table so the mornings had light in them. Silas, she said, I'm thinking. You think loudly. That's not a thing that's possible. It is with you. You get a particular expression. She looked at him sideways. What are you thinking? He thought about how to say it exactly right, which was always the challenge with things that mattered. I'm thinking that I wrote an advertisement for someone who would expect nothing from me, and I found someone who expected everything I was actually capable of, and then showed me where that was higher than I thought. He looked at her. And I'm thinking that's not what I asked for, and I'm not sure I deserved it, and I'm certain it's the best thing that happened to me. Adelaide held his gaze for a long moment. That, she said, is the most complete sentence I've ever heard you construct. I've been working on it. How long? Since approximately November. She looked at him with the fully open expression, no watchfulness, nothing held back, just Adelaide at full attention, the way she was when she'd decided something entirely and wasn't managing the decision anymore. I came here to disappear, she said. I came here because it was far enough and different enough that no one would think to look for me. I was not looking for a life. I was looking for a place to stop moving. She paused. And I got a life completely by accident. A real one, with accounts that need balancing and cattle that need watching and fences that need building and a man who argues about roof angles and is wrong about them and concedes only when I climb up and demonstrate. She paused again. I didn't expect that. I want you to know that I know I didn't earn it by trying for it. I found it by stopping. Maybe that's when you find things, he said. When you stop running from what you don't want long enough to notice what's in front of you. She thought about that. Possibly, she said, though the drainage did help. He laughed. A real one, not the almost variety it came out of him fully, and it was the laugh of a man who was actually somewhere he wanted to be. She looked at him laughing and smiled. Not the adjacent to kind, the actual kind. And the porch held both sounds for a moment in the May evening before things settled back into the quiet they were used to. The summer came in completely by June, which meant the cistern project Adelaide had marked on the calendar in April could finally proceed. And it proceeded on her timeline and to her specifications. And when it was finished, the west overflow worked correctly for the first time since the cistern was built, and Adelaide stood looking at it with the satisfaction of a problem finally solved, and Silas stood beside her and said, You were right. I know, she said, about the cistern, I know. And the roof angle, I know, and the drainage. Silas, I'm just making the record complete. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who understood perfectly well what he was doing and was deciding whether to allow it. Yes, she said. You have conceded to me on all major technical matters and several minor ones, and your ranch is significantly more functional as a result. It is. Are we done with the inventory? I also think you were right about Barton's boy, and the fence timing, and the January cattle illness. We are clearly not done with the inventory, and the kitchen cabinet reorganization. The cabinet reorganization was not in dispute. That was purely a matter of logic. I disputed it. You disputed it for 4 days, and then you started reaching for things in the right place automatically, which is the actual concession. Words are optional. She turned toward the house. I'm going to make coffee. He followed her inside, into the kitchen that was hers and his, that smelled like the good wood of the stove and the garden coming through the window and the particular warmth of a house that had people in it who intended to stay. The lamp was on the table, where she'd put it in February. The accounts were on the shelf, organized the way she organized things. The door at the end of the hall was open, resting easy, light moving through it. Adelaide made coffee with the efficiency of someone who had been making coffee in this kitchen long enough that the motions were automatic, and Silas sat at the table and watched her the way he'd gotten comfortable watching her, not hiding it, not making a production of it, just watching, because she was worth watching in the specific way that people were worth watching when they were fully and unself-consciously themselves. She brought the cups and sat across from him, and they drank coffee in the late afternoon and didn't say much, because they'd learned that the silence between them had become the kind you chose rather than the kind you endured, and that was its own kind of thing. Outside, the East Channel ran with the late summer water, and the North Field stood in good grass, and the kitchen garden was in full production, and the fence line was solid, and the West Cistern overflow was finally, definitively correct. The letter Adelaide wrote to her father went out in June, and his response came back in August, shorter than she'd expected, more honest than she'd thought him capable of, and it did not repair what had been broken between them, and it was not intended to. What it was a door, left open at a careful distance, and whether she chose to walk through it someday or not, the choice was entirely hers, and she knew it, and that made all the difference. She told Silas what it said on a Thursday evening on the porch, not reading it to him but summarizing it, and when she'd finished, he said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to sit with it." "That's enough for now." "Yes," she said, "it is." In September, just before the anniversary of Adelaide's arrival in Blackthorn Ridge, she found Silas in the barn doing something he hadn't done in the year. She'd known him, going through a box he'd brought down from the high shelf at the back. A wooden crate she'd never seen him touch before. Inside it were a few things she recognized as Lenora's from the back room. A small journal, a pair of work gloves worn soft at the fingers. A photograph of two people she could identify from the way Silas stood in it. He looked up when she came in. He didn't close the box. "Thought I'd move some of these things out of that room," he said. "Not away from the house, just not all in one place." She looked at the box and then at him. "Where are you going to put them?" "The journal can stay in the main room. The photograph, too." "The gloves," he paused, "I don't know. Somewhere they get used." She thought about that. "The garden," she said. "Work gloves belong in the garden." He looked at the gloves in his hands. Then he nodded once. She left him in the barn and didn't say anything else, because it was his to do and he was doing it well, and some things were better accompanied by presence than words. That evening they ate supper and cleaned up and sat on the porch in the September air, which was cool now with the first suggestion of what was coming, and the ranch was around them in the particular quiet of a working place in the right kind of season. He put his hand on the porch rail near hers, not over hers, but near it, and she moved her hand the small distance until they were touching. And they sat like that for a while, watching the evening come across the North Field, and the East Channel glinting once in the last light. There were things that had been hard. There were things that would be hard again, her father's complicated future in her life, the work that a child added to an already full existence, the ongoing argument about the south fence posts that they'd been having for 3 weeks and hadn't resolved, the particular stubbornness they'd both been born with that meant almost every decision of consequence passed through at least one significant disagreement before it landed anywhere. None of that was going away. That was the actual texture of a life, not the complications that came before it. Two imperfect people with strong opinions and old wounds and the specific kind of stubbornness that had kept them both intact through things that could have broken them, choosing the same future from the same porch on the same September evening. Not because it was easy, because it was real, and real was what both of them had been looking for, without fully knowing that was the name of it. The north field held its color in the fading light. The lamp inside cast its warm circle through the kitchen window. Somewhere down the east channel, water was moving exactly where Adelaide had calculated it would move, doing the work it had been designed to do. And in the house behind them, at the end of the hallway, the door was open. All the doors were open.